Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Improving Career and Technical Education by Reforming High Schools and Community Colleges. My name is Andy Smerick, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Education Policy Studies here at AEI. Today's event is part of our effort, AEI's effort, in the face of the skills gap, the changing economy, social challenges, our effort to try to prepare more and more people for the world of work. Career and Technical Education, CTE, as many of us will be talking about it today, has reemerged as a popular and hopefully potentially really exciting option. Part of our job here at AEI is we want to make sure that the policies we have in place actually enable civil society, practitioners and social entrepreneurs and educators, local leaders and others, to make sure that they can develop and then operate these programs that can serve as many people in a high quality way as possible. So my colleague John Bailey, who's going to be moderating the first panel, he and I have this little podcast we've been running, the New Skills Marketplace. And we found that through all of our interviews, there are lots of new providers and new programs and new funding streams, and there are interesting innovations right now happening in the for-profit and nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. But at the same time, we all want to make sure that we're focused simultaneously on the long-standing, successful, existing organizations that to this day, right now, tens of millions of students are in high schools and community colleges. So today we're going to be talking about the students who attend these schools, the courses they're taking, what kind of goals the institutions actually have, and what kind of reforms we think are needed. And this event today is part of a much larger set of activities we have going on in this general area. We have the podcast I talked about, the series of papers being released today, some of which are available outside, a number of case studies on really promising local activities that are happening that we're going to be releasing in the weeks to come, an edited volume, and much more. We hope you keep an eye out for all of that work. And these activities that I just described are part of a much larger AEI initiative that goes across the entire organization, designed to appreciate and we would say advance what we're calling human dignity. So it's a series of interrelated study areas, research areas, all aimed at trying to make sure that public policies, and as we like to think about it, society in general, recognize and then work their best to try to fulfill the potential of every single American. So this includes obviously our work on education and on skills development, but it also touches the opioid addiction crisis, prisoner reentry, family formation, poverty alleviation, and more. So we hope you engage with this work as well. We think it's very important, not just because it's good for our nation, but because it's really good for our most disadvantaged fellow citizens. Okay. On to today's event. Here's the order of operations. We have two panels. The first one is on CTE in high schools, and it is going to be moderated by John. The second one is on community colleges, which will directly follow this one, to be moderated by our other great colleague, Mark Schneider. They are going to introduce the topics, the presenters, lead the discussions, and so forth. Just in terms of housekeeping, a couple notes here. This event is being live streamed. Full video will be available after the event, and it will be turned into a podcast on our channel. We're using the hashtag CTE at AEI, if you want to tweet at me or someone else. If you don't mind, please turn off or silence your cell phones. We would appreciate that. And lastly, let me just thank the folks who too seldom get thanked for events like this. It's people like Rooney and Doug who work on the AEI team on the policy side, but also our wonderful events conferences team who make sure all of these things work so seamlessly. We greatly appreciate your work in making this all happen, so thank you. Now I'm going to hand the baton off to John Bailey, an old friend and colleague. He's a visiting fellow here at AEI, but he's also concurrently a fellow at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and for the Walton Family Foundation. He worked at the White House from 2007 to 2009. He was a special assistant to President Bush for domestic policy. He also worked at the U.S. Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Commerce. He co-founded Whiteboard Advisors. He sits on the board of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, and he is just overall one of the best guys you would want to know. So John, welcome. Please kick us off.
Great, thank you. Move this out of the way. We have a great panel, a really timely topic, as Andy said. We had some researchers here at AI look at all the governor's State of the State addresses, and CTE was the most discussed issue, reform, by governors outside of school finance. And so it's really clear that there's a lot of interest in the states, particularly with state policymakers that are kind of wrestling with CTE policy. It's also very timely in this town as we're talking a lot about the future of work and what does that mean and what does it look like? Have we focused too much on the college side of college readiness and not enough on the career side? And are they the same, different? And we're going to dive into that today with a great panel with some new research. I'm just going to introduce our panelists and then kick it off to Nat, who will give us a little preview of his research. But first, Albert Cheng is a postdoctoral fellow in the program on education policy and governance at Harvard University. He's also co-founder of an affiliated research fellow of Kerosene? Is that how you pronounce it? Great, which is an initiative at the University of Arkansas, where he received his PhD in education policy. His work is centered on developing new measures of non-cognitive skills and studying the ways that education programs and practices affect them in students. And he's been featured in academic journals and media outlets, such as the Economics of Education Review, Education X, and NPR. Next, we have Gary Hooklander, who's president of Connect Ed, the California Center of College and Career. He began his career in 1966 as a brakeman for the Western Maryland Railroad. So I hope we get to hear more about that. That's
happy to talk about that.
Yeah. He's devoted his entire professional life to helping young people learn by doing, connecting education to opportunities, challenges, and rewards to be found through work. He's widely known for his expertise in career and technical education and many other aspects of elementary and secondary and post-secondary education. He's consulted extensively with the U.S. Department of Education, state departments of education, local school districts, foundations, and other clients. Nancy Hoffman is a friend to many of us here. She's a senior advisor at Jobs for the Future, a national nonprofit based in Boston. She's co-founders of the Pathways to Prosperity State Network, which works to ensure that many young youth complete high school, attain a post-secondary credential with currency in the labor market, and get a launch on a career. She also serves on the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education. Nat Malkus is a resident scholar and the Deputy Director of Education Policy at AI, where he specializes in K-12 policy. He was a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research, where he led research teams analyzing national education data on topics from college students taking remedial courses, comparisons between charter schools and traditional public schools, and tracking student achievement and graduation rates in schools undergoing turnaround efforts. He also spent 4 years as a middle school teacher in Maryland. So one of the toughest jobs in America, middle school. I know, because I gave my teachers. We also have Andy Smerek, who you just met. He's a mortgage fellow in education policy studies at AI, where he works in education-related domestic social policy issues. He concurrently serves as the president of the Maryland State Board of Education. He served at the White House as a White House fellow in the Domestic Policy Council, and he was a deputy assistant secretary of planning, evaluation, and policy development at the U.S. Department of Education, and a distinguished visiting fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation. Distinguished. He also has served as a deputy commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Education, where he helped lead initiatives on the Elementary and Secondary Education Act waiver, the state's successful Race to the Top application, and the launch of a new teacher evaluation system. So we have a great panel that has some original research that we're going to have presented, and then we have some discussion, and then we're going to turn it over to you for some questions. So Nat is going to kick us off. So Nat?
Thanks, John. So I'm going to be presenting today on a working paper. Right now it's titled 23 Years of Career and Technical Education. We're going to try and move that to 30 years, which is a much better title. To do that, we're going to have to go back in time a little further, and I'll explain that. But largely, I'm doing this as a descriptive look at CTE course taking over time, looking at graduates' transcripts. And basically what we're looking at is what have the changes been in CTE course taking in high school in terms of credits, both overall and then by occupational areas. And the second point we want to look at is CTE concentrators. The difference between a concentrator and a student taking a single credit is that concentrators take 3 CTE credits all in the same occupational area. And then also we want to keep an eye on the attributes of these CTE credit holders and concentrators. So to do this, we look at nationally representative surveys of transcript data. So if you look in the middle here, the bulk of this comes from what's called the High School Transcript Study, which has been running sort of semi-regularly off and on for years. We're looking at 90, 2000, 2005, and 2009 data today. We also wanted to do this study to sort of update that because the next high school transcript study is not slated to go into the field until 2019. And I don't want to wait a decade to find out what may or may not be happening to CTE or other students. And so I took advantage of updating this with another nationally representative data set that's a little different, the high school longitudinal study. This is not going to be done by the National Center for Education Statistics because it's not a perfect match. Actually, the 2013 data cover students who graduated in 2013 and who were in 9th grade in 2009. It's a longitudinal study. Because of that perfect match for good reasons, NCES is not going to make this connection, but I'm happy to. It may be imperfect, but it should be informative. And again, eventually we'll have to do a little bit more to finish this out by looking at high school and beyond data, reaching back as far as 1983. One quick other word to just to note on methods: coding transcripts is not fun. It is difficult, and they also, of course, change the way they code them over time. So we started with the 2013 SCED framework, which is the School Codes for the Exchange of Data, I believe. And then we looked back at a different course coding framework, which was used in the past, CSSC. All this is to say we did not crosswalk these course for course, but rather put them in the buckets of occupational concentration that is being used in the HSLS study. The idea here is there's a bridge from way back when to studies that will come out in the future. So what are those occupational clusters we're talking about? And you will find different lists out there. The one that we're using here has a number of things that will sort of make sense, and hopefully they'll make more sense as I go through them a little bit. But we're talking about agriculture, architecture and construction is a bucket, business, communications, information science, engineering, healthcare, and so on and so forth. So to a picture of the data. What you see here is from 1990 to 2013. These are in Carnegie units. Students' average all kinds of credits has gone up. Okay. That's largely driven by an increase in the number of academic credits they've taken. Okay. If you look at CTE, you see a slightly different pattern. It's sort of hard to see because, well, the first thing is CTE courses make up a relative minority of all courses. So let's zoom in here, and then you can see, wow, you know, it looks like there's actually something of a decline from 1990 to 2005, a slow roll down, and then a greater decline from 2005 to 2013. Notice that those are where the data points are, so there's nothing really special about 2005. It's just that after that, there's a downturn. The other thing, the value of going into this 2013 data is without it, we would be left with the question of, well, is that downturn from 2005 to 2009, is that just one data point? Is that just one survey? And by adding the 2013 data, I can tell you fairly confidently, no. It seems like there's a downturn of about 20% over this time period. So let's disaggregate that and look at this terribly ugly slide. I'm going to try and break this down into chunks so we can sort of see what's happening here. The first is this miscellaneous group. These are CTE courses, but they don't fit under an occupation. So this is family consumer science, general sort of career development, that sort of thing. Then we have what I'm calling sort of the flat line categories. This is communications, human services, which is sort of a catch-all, engineering, transportation, architecture, and agriculture. Those last four particularly are sort of the stereotypical CTE categories. By and large, they're fairly flat. We also have some growing categories over this time period. Computer science and and healthcare, two to note, and then their smaller cousins, public service and tourism. And then we see this big chunk here, manufacturing and business. Wow, look at that decline in business. It's really remarkable, right? So I think it's important to kind of consider how meaningful this is. So just take a minute to think, how much should we care about this downturn in CTE course taking? Well, let's look at it without business. If we don't care about business so much, the downturn is not much of a downturn. And if you take away manufacturing, we're actually seeing a rise and then sort of a plateau. And so if business is the main driver here, why might that be? Well, it's driven by specific courses, primarily keyboarding, typewriting, word processing, and office procedures. Those four accounted for about 2.3 million credits for graduates in 1990 and about 600,000 credits in 2009. So if the drop in those credits accounts for primarily the drop in CTE course taking, we might not actually be facing a problem. So let's look at concentrators for a few minutes. You're going to see a lot of the same patterns, but a little bit exacerbated. Again, you have to collect 3 courses in one area to be called a concentrator. In 1990, about a third of students were a concentrator, and about a fifth are concentrators in 2013. Right? This is largely driven by business. Again, we see a drop of about 85%, and really, I mean, that's a big drop. Approaching 90 to approaching 4, maybe, over 23 years. Manufacturing was sort of the second decline, and you can just see how much smaller of an impact it's had. Again, these are the flat concentrators, similar to the flat credit that we saw earlier. Again, these are some of those core stereotypical CTE courses: ag, architecture and construction, transportation. And then we have some growing concentrations. Healthcare is a big one, computer science, engineering. There's a few here. The communications has this strange downturn right at the end, which I'm not sure if I buy. But by and large, we see that there are certain clusters that are growing, certain that are flat, and some that are declining. So I wanted to look at a couple of student characteristics quickly and school characteristics. Looking at it by sex, in the past couple of weeks, I think, there's been a certain appointment to the Department of Education that was sort of derailed in part because of comments about how female students don't participate in CTE. Well, that wasn't always the case. If you look at 1990, I don't think that's a statistically significant difference. However, the estimate is higher for females. And then you see this rapid decline, whereas males are more or less flat and then start to decline after 2005. And again, we can see that that's because of business, right? That gray dashed line is the fall in female business courses, whereas males just never took the same amount of business courses until after the turn of the century here. Again, there's differences in manufacturing, where males take more as well. These are a bunch of courses, and it's hard to see, but I'll just highlight that the males are the solid lines, which are high for agriculture, transport, and architecture. And that may not be surprising that male students, that sort of fits stereotypes, and they're powerful. And for sure, female students are less often concentrators in these areas. But there are other areas like healthcare and human services that are that are dominated by female students. So it's just not true that female students do not take advantage of CTE. I put this up here in large part because I'm hoping that someone on the panel can explain why, but I will just point out that CTE course taking in the South is relatively flat, or at least comparatively, and then in the West, it's just lower across the board and has dropped precipitously. I do not know why. I have this little asterisk here for that Northeast because I don't want you to read too much into that estimate. The standard error is very large. So this is not the same data, but it's a question that I'm going to pursue before I get to the end of it. And I think that this is sort of parallel data that tells an important story and raises an important question, and that is sort of who are we serving with CTE programs? So let me explain this very quickly. These are math scores of 12th graders, and they're divided into 3 categories by their answers to the question, what kind of high school program are you in? And those who said academic or college prep, not surprisingly, above average math scores, right? This is nationally representative data, and they're about a third of a standard deviation above average. Okay. General ed, about a quarter of a standard deviation below average, sort of makes sense, steady. Those who identified as having a vocational track have moved up a third of a standard deviation in 10 years. Hopefully the slowness with which I spoke of that made it sound important, because that is a huge shift in test scores that really cannot be explained by, at least in my opinion, over 10 years, by anything other than different kinds of kids are identifying as CTE. right? Programs may be drawing kids differently, and the kids that they're drawing, more of them are higher scorers. This is an underlying shift that I think is important to ask questions about. So my time is coming to a close here. Just a couple of takeaways. CTE course taking is down both by credit and concentrator. This is driven by business and manufacturing. Sort of changes in the technological soup that kids grow up in, I think, explain a lot of that business. And perhaps labor market changes explain why manufacturing may not be the greatest concentration to be in. Both of these may actually not be a problem. So the overall downturn is not necessarily something to be alarmed about. We see differences by sex and region, and later, with more time, I could talk about differences by race and school attributes. And this question, which again, I haven't established, but in initial runs of the data, it looks like it mirrors this, is that CTE student test scores are rising over time and not by trivial amounts. And so I'm very interested in what these changes in these programs are, whether they have to do more with the students and the growth in them, or whether the design of the programs is just drawing on a different set of students. The importance being there, if it's a programmatic change, if it's a selection effect, what kinds of students do those changes benefit? So I'll leave you with that question. Pass it to Albert.
Great, thank you. Great setup for Albert's.
Yeah, perfect setup, actually. So just first acknowledge my co-author on this, Colin Hitt, who's in the audience with us. But I'm going to pick up right where Nat left off. So Nat kind of described the course-taking patterns and then left off with this kind of description of CTE students. And so in this paper, Colin and I are going to actually take a deeper dive into describing the kinds of students that enter CTE programs and take CTE courses. So I want to set the stage here by maybe highlighting two maybe preconceptions that we generally have about CTE programs and students. One is that CTE programs are non-academic, right, and that's usually portrayed in some kind of negative light. And then part and parcel with that is that students who enter and select into these CTE programs, when it comes to academics, they're just kind of unmotivated. Nat's graph at the end, you do see that they score lower in terms of math test scores. And to that point, it's not just in Nat's data, but we actually have plenty of other data that documents this trend, that students who select into CTE programs, when it comes to test scores of cognitive ability in math and English, they just don't perform as well. Now, what's interesting is that CTE programs, now this first result may not be surprising. CTE programs, the best evidence that we have evaluating these programs, they really don't show much effect on test scores. So these students with lower test scores are selecting into these programs. They're coming out not necessarily with any higher test scores in math and English. But there's a puzzle to this, and the puzzle is that despite these, the lack of movement in test scores, we do see higher graduation rates from high school. So what's going on there? The kids aren't performing better academically. Their cognitive ability in terms of math and English test scores isn't increasing. Could it be non-cognitive skills? And what I mean by that are things like personality traits, dispositions, character, things like conscientiousness, motivation. Maybe they're different in that dimension, and that might explain this pattern. So this is kind of the setup, the motivation for the research question that Colin and I want to get at. Pretty straightforward question. Do students who enter CTE programs differ from their peers in terms of non-cognitive skills? So just to tell you the answer right off the bat, yes. And I'm going to show you that CTE students, they're not as academically inclined, kind of in line with maybe some of our expectations, but they do seem to exhibit a little more conscientiousness when it comes to other things. Okay? So I'm going to do this in another one of these U.S. Department of Ed data sets, the Educational Longitudinal Study of 2002. We've got a nationally representative sample of about 15,000 10th graders. They're in the class, 2000, well, plus 3, so class of 2005, 2006, I believe, if I'm doing my math correctly. And they're followed through adulthood. And then what we're going to do is simply look at their non-cognitive skills in 3 ways. Okay, so the first way we're going to look at their non-cognitive skills is the conventional way to do this, which is to simply ask the students, how motivated are you? When it comes to doing math, are you motivated in class? Agree, disagree, strongly agree? Ask these kinds of items, and we get some measure of, we're going to do motivation, and we call something which we call academic tenacity. So how confident they feel about math and English, and how much effort they put into those academic subjects. Now, we're not going to stop there. What's neat about the data set that we have is that this data actually asks the math and English teachers themselves to tell us about their students. So we're going to have some measures based on teacher reports of these students' classroom behavior. So is the student attentive? Does the student show up to class? Are they disruptive? Do they do their homework? And this is going to be reported by their teacher. Okay, that's going to give us another look at these non-cognitive skills. And then the third way we're going to look at this is through these new behavioral measures that Colin and I have developed. So instead of asking kids or anyone else to tell us about their non-cognitive skills, we're going to watch them perform a certain task, and then their performance on that task is going to show us. Okay, so it's show, not tell. And what's the task that we've designed here? Well, as part of ELS, as you've already seen from these measures, there's a series of surveys that the students have to actually complete. Well, it's possible that the effort and diligence that students exert on the surveys that we're already asking them to do might tell us something about their diligence and effort in general. And Colin and I have shown this in actually a lot of data sets where if you can control for cognitive ability, family background, the number of, for instance, items that a kid skips in middle school, independent of all those other family background demographics, tells us something about their future long-run life prospects. So students, for example, that skip questions, exhibit low survey effort that way. They're less likely to go to college. They, in some cases, are less likely to be employed later on. They make less money later on as adults. The other way to look at this is, so maybe some kids don't skip questions. So if you're a teacher like me and you've given some multiple choice tests, you've seen some students give you particularly kind of puzzling answer patterns. The answer to every question is A, the first choice. So maybe some students don't skip questions, but they just straight line or just fill in bubbles randomly. Okay, that's another indication of low effort on surveys. And so we can pick up on that behavior, and we're going to use that, again, as a measure, a behavioral measure of non-cognitive skills. Okay, so I'll jump right into the results. First set of results here are based on student self-reports of motivation. Okay, so let me just walk you through these charts here. So the best way to think about this is through a thought experiment. Okay, I'm going to give you just 3 students. They go to the same school. They have the same test scores in math and English, similar demographic background characteristics. The only difference between them is that one student has an average level of a particular non-cognitive skill. The second student is about 1 standard deviation higher on that non-cognitive skill. And then the other student is about 1 standard deviation lower in terms of non-cognitive skill. So 3 students that are pretty much the same except for their levels of a particular non-cognitive skill. So if you look at that first bar, that blue bar, the dark blue bar, that's a self-report of intrinsic motivation in math. In other words, how interested, kind of naturally interested, is the student in math? Well, from this chart, it turns out that if you're more interested in math, you go on to take fewer CTE courses. And then that bar on the very, I guess it's your left, the students who are less interested in math are the ones that go on to take more CTE courses. You see the same thing in English language arts intrinsic motivation. Okay? And so you can look at this a different way. What if we ask students to self-report how confident they feel about doing math and English and maybe their general effort in those academic subjects? The students that are generally more confident, they feel better about themselves in these academic subjects. The students that exhibit more effort, so those are the students to the right, they end up taking fewer CTE courses. And the students that are just generally less confident about these core academic subjects, they go on to take more CTE course credits. Okay, now, the picture gets a little interesting here. Because if you ask teachers to describe their students, okay, so here, these are teacher descriptions of whether students are disruptive, attentive, or whether they work hard in class. It turns out these behaviors don't tell us anything about how many CTE credits the students eventually take. So in other words, the students that go on to take more CTE credits in high school, they're neither more nor less disruptive, attentive, or hardworking in their core academic classes as reported by their teacher. In fact, the only difference that we see based on teacher reports is that light blue middle bar indicated by the stars there. The students that go on to take more CTE credits in high school, they're actually a little more likely to show up to class. They're equally likely to do homework. They're equally likely to come to class on time. Okay? Now to muddy the picture a little bit more, what if we look at our behavioral measures of non-cognitive skills? So this is item response rate. So are the students actually doing the survey, okay, answering all the items, and careful answering? Are the students not just randomly bubbling in answers? Are they actually putting thought and effort into doing these surveys? It turns out that the students who are more careful, more diligent about doing surveys, those are the ones that are going into CTE courses later on in high school. Okay? So just to highlight a few things, okay? Not only do we see this difference among students simply attending conventional high schools, we actually don't see any differences in non-cognitive skills for students going into standalone vocational tech schools as well. And as it turns out, by age 25 in this data, the students that go on to take more CTE credits or enter CTE programs, they're more likely to finish high school, they're more likely to be employed full-time, and they do actually end up making higher wages, at least by young adulthood at age 25. Okay? So what's the general takeaway here? Maybe consistent with our preconceptions, CTE students aren't really academically inclined, but they seem to exhibit more conscientious behaviors that are conducive to their well-being in the long run. And so what this might kind of suggest is that, CTE programs, they do seem to provide educational opportunities that benefit a unique group of students. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All right. I think that my paper here may add a little bit of texture to what we've learned so far about these students in the schools. Okay, so my paper is part policy analysis and part case study. It's about New Jersey's distinctive approach to CTE high schools, namely giving county governments some power to run these schools as opposed to just traditional districts. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. 4 different areas. I'm going to begin with the basics of the schools, then just talk about the 4 policy decisions that seem to be most germane to how these schools are operating, then the consequences of those policy decisions, and then end up with some conclusions and recommendations. Okay, the basics. What are these schools? New Jersey has 21 counties. Each of them has one of these county vocational programs. Some counties have one vocational school. Some of them have multiple campuses. The schools in total serve about 32,000 kids. Importantly, traditional school districts are allowed to have CTE programs in the state. They do so in their traditional high schools. But what we're talking about here are the single-purpose CTE-oriented county-run schools. And then lastly here, it appears that Delaware is the only other state that gives county governments this same kind of right to operate exclusively CTE schools, although there are some other states where they have regional CTE programs. For those of you interested in governance, what's interesting about this is that New Jersey has essentially said, we believe that public education needs to be embedded in a public institution. However, that institution need not be a traditional school district. It can be a county government. And this is going to become an important theme. And lastly, for those of you who do not know the Garden State, it is very different from there are rural areas, there are areas of great poverty, there's a whole lot of wealth, different employers, and this becomes important as well down the line. Okay, key policy decisions. 4 things really stand out here. One is this one related to governance. State law allows these county governments to create boards of vocational education. They're separate from the state's 590 small school districts. And what's important is that county elected leaders are the ones who appoint members to these boards. So you start to see the tight relationship between the programs and the county government. These are still public schools in all ways, and I'm going to come back to that as well. Second, these are emphatically schools of choice. These are not programs embedded in assigned traditional comprehensive high school. Kids are choosing to be there. They're choosing to be part of a CTE specific high school. Third, they have admissions policies, meaning entrance criteria. Some use 7th and 8th grade test scores or the courses you've taken or attendance or discipline. How this is used differs based on school and based on county, but they are used. Last, funding. The schools are part of the state funding formula, meaning they get state aid like other public schools. They actually get an increment in the funding formula when it's fully funded, about 25 cents on the dollar extra because it's just expensive to run these schools. But county governments, because they are in charge of these schools, also tax their people to fund the schools. And interestingly, these schools are allowed to charge what's called tuition. It's not to families, but it's to the sending district. If a sending district has students going to the vocational school applies a tax to the district to help cover the costs of the school. Okay, so those are the 4 policy things that I think are important. Now here are the consequences of them that I think are important. The first relates to variation. Since New Jersey's counties are so different from one another in terms of employers and everything else, vocational schools have very different priorities. In the northern part of the state, near New York, unsurprisingly, finance programs are more popular. In the middle part of the state, where there are some transportation hubs, unsurprisingly, they just started a big logistics program. Closer to the shore, hospitality programs are more popular. Interesting. When you embed it in a county, they start to reflect what those counties need and what the students are interested in. But related to that is the second thing. When you add together geographic variability and parental choice and the ability to set entrance criteria and the ability of counties to create whatever kind of schools they want, you end up getting schools that look very different in terms of composition and performance. So let me give you an example of this. In some cases, a county vocational school will look just like its county in terms of demographics. Here's one example from Somerset County. The blue bars are, I believe, the county itself, and the school-age population, and the gray columns are the vocational school. Vocational school looks just like the county. It is a match. It is a mirror. But now look at Bergen County. Each column represents one of the different campuses within the vocational school system. There is wide variation in the populations attending the different campuses. So Bergen County Academies, the gray columns, more than 50% of those students are Asian, even though they represent a way smaller proportion of the county as a whole. If you look at economically disadvantaged ED, you see that the Paramus campus has 6 times as many low-income kids as some of the other schools. Okay. Now in terms of performance, this is Middlesex County that has these 5 different programs. Here are the average PSAT scores which kids in New Jersey take. You see that the difference spans more than 500 points between these different vocational schools, all the way from over 1,300 to just north of 800 among these different schools. Interestingly, there's one Bergen County campus, a vocational school. Their average PSAT score is around, I believe it's 1355, which puts it at the 98th percentile nationally. For those of you who grew up, like maybe when I did, this is not really what we thought of as a VOTEC school at the 98th percentile nationally when it came to PSAT scores. So we start to see maybe the kids attending some of these schools are different than they were in the past. Okay, for those of you who want to know about state test scores, they mirror what I've been telling you already. This again is Middlesex County. 2 of the schools, 100% of their kids are proficient. In the 3 other schools, it's 50% or less. So again, we're seeing variation in the students who are attending and their performance levels. Okay. The third consequence, let me just get caught up here, is that because these schools have virtually all of the same requirements as traditional public schools, CTE is supplemental, it's additional. They don't get to not do the other things that are required under law. So if you walk into this school, you will find traditional departments and classrooms, but then you will also see a separate wing or a separate floor with cosmetology, with welding, with carpentry, and all the rest. Meaning these schools can be big, sprawling, and high cost, and how they get their funding is influenced by this as well. So for example, here is the per student cost of all of the different counties. New Jersey's a high spending state, and that's the The red column is the average, about $20,000 per county, per district. You see that in the county vocational schools, 3 of them are actually spending more than $30,000 per kid in these vocational schools. It's not cheap to run them. The counties on the right are mostly the lower cost of living rural counties, often in the southern part of the state. This is the sources of funding. As you'll see, the county governments, because they run and they like these schools, are providing the preponderance of money. State aid is second, but you will also see that almost a quarter of the funding actually comes from these tuition charges, the vocational school charging the districts that are sending the kids to these, which causes some tension, which I'll talk about here in a second. Fourth consequence is this tight relationship that these schools have with their county leaders because of all of these institutional things I've talked about. They're having ongoing conversations about budgets, about the needs of their local employers, and much, much more. One of the most fascinating anecdotes I heard from one of the school leaders during a site visit was that county leaders are really afraid that their kids are going to find jobs or go to college in other states and never come back. And so the county wants their vocational schools to be tightly aligned with the labor market locally, so kids work there or go to college there. And so they're also very mindful of building a pipeline from the vocational school to local colleges and universities. And that turned out to be maybe the most interesting thing that I found in all of these visits and studies, is how tightly aligned these vocational schools are with their community colleges. 2 of the schools are actually on the same campus as their community college. They share facilities, they share staff. Many of their students are taking not just 3, 6, 9, often 15, 30, 45 college credits at their community college. Some of these schools brag that they want their students to graduate high school with a diploma and a certificate for work, and in some cases an AA degree. And the last consequence is, I've been alluding to this all along, are the tensions. There's absolutely no doubt that there's a difficult, strained relationship often between these county schools and their traditional districts. They can be accused, not unfairly, of creaming the highest performing students from their districts, of running selective admission schools. If a district loses a student to a vocational school, that district loses the state aid, often has to pay tuition, and get this, has to pay for the transportation of its student to go to the vocational school. Lastly, and this is just sort of salt in the wounds from what I've heard, the vocational school is actually able to go on site and recruit students from the district school to go to the vocational school. If you're a district leader, you could see how you'd be a little bit grumpy about these things. The last point about tension is I just found really interesting. Is this thing about old CTE and new CTE. There is tension in these schools between the programs that are aimed at the traditional blue-collar jobs like welding and then the more advanced or more modern things like engineering. And there can be tension between teachers and staff about this. And it raises this underlying question that I think we're all alluding to, which is, who are these schools actually supposed to be serving? Non-college going kids or college going kids? Which raises the question, what is today's CTE high school supposed to be all about? So let me just end with these conclusions. One is giving county governments authority in this area enabled a sector of public education to evolve and have a bunch of freedoms that they probably would not have had otherwise. So I would commend this to other states. If you don't want to give these schools to your county governments, think about a different governance model under the state, under cities, maybe under a regional authority. Maybe chartering is the right way to do it. Second is this higher education partnerships piece. It appeared to us that it was a natural positive consequence of having community colleges and vocational high schools under one single government body because they were forced and had the opportunity to get along. If you want to do these schools in a different state but not put them in the county government, I would recommend to policymakers, think deeply about how you are going to compensate for this. How can the CTE high school get along with institutions of higher education given that the county link isn't there? Third, I call it two-way choice. Families are choosing these schools, and because of entrance criteria, the schools can choose the students. There are lots of benefits to that, but the costs are also non-trivial in terms of the frustration about the districts, the costs of it, and then the confusion about who are these schools supposed to serve. And then the last one is just clarity of purpose. CTE high schools, as far as I can tell, can do lots and lots of really interesting things. They can be aimed at non-college going students. students who want to go to a 2-year program, kids who want to go to a 4-year program, kids who want to work locally, kids who want to get a job in some other state. All of those are legitimate goals of career and technical education, but they are different goals. And to try to assume that you can have a CTE program that does all of those, you're going to find that your policies are running into each other at times. So I would say based on what I learned here, any state that wants to get into this and think about reforming their CTE policies, don't begin with the reform first. Begin with deciding actually what you want to accomplish, and then have the policies follow that. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you. Now joining us for just sort of reacting a little bit to the research we had, and then we'll have a conversation with the panelists, and then we'll open it up and bring you into the conversation. But Nancy, I'd love to start with you, just what your reactions are to some really interesting and meaty research and new trends coming out of this.
So I, having just finished a book called Learning for Careers, I'm really not a scholar. I am a practitioner. I have a lot of dirt under my fingernails from my last trip was to southern Minnesota to look at some small towns where there are 4,000 people in this town, and half of them are Hispanic and arrived there within the last 15 years. So I have been all over the United States. The thing that I would just start with is CTE schools in many cases are doing much, much better by young people than your sort of run-of-the-mill comprehensive high school, in which the whole notion of what the meaning is of work in human lives is absent. And there are maybe some random CTE courses, but nothing that will really help a young person get on the road to a career with a middle-class wage. So I was just going to say that a few of the things that we look for when we're in schools to see whether these programs are good are reflected in ways that both Albert and Andy have talked about in their research. So the first thing that we look for are the young people getting marketable skills? That is, are they learning the technical things that they need so that when they get on to a 2-year degree, and many of them are already having a head start because they're taking dual enrollment courses, and it doesn't have to be that you're in the same county government, because community colleges, at least in my neck of the woods, which is Northeast, are losing population, and they need good, well-prepared high school students who are coming into their programs. Anyway, so you look for that. Are the programs up to date, and will the young person with an associate's degree or a certification be able to enter the labor market so they can have a job and either save for a 4-year degree, get an employer who will pay for a 4-year degree, or happily move up a career ladder there. The second thing I always look for is the piece that really speaks to, is there a difference between college and career readiness? I've spent a lot of time looking at European vocational systems. Another book I wrote is called Schooling in the Workplace, about 6 countries and their very strong vocational systems. What you see there, and particularly in Switzerland, which has been my favorite place, is that everyone believes that vocational education is great. 70% of young people join it rather than going to an academic high school. But the principle is that while anything that can be taught in the workplace should be taught there, the skills have to be broad. The employer should not own the knowledge, the student should. So we look to see, is there a context for the skills? And are there integral connections, which Gary can talk about, between the academic courses and the vocational courses? The third thing is my current obsession, and it speaks to really where Albert was going and what I found fascinating. And that is, we give young people the message, get a degree and everything will be fine. Well, if you're poor and you don't have connections and you don't have a social network, it may not be fine. It may not be fine if you're upper middle class and you think you're going to be a practicing artist, but you have some family supports and some networks that you can fall back on. But what we see is that these non-cognitive skills, and I'm assuming you're working some with David Deming? Or David Deming?
I know his office is just north or upstairs.
Yeah, you know, I teach there too.
Yes, I know. You're from the area.
The work really suggests that employers are very happy to have people with math skills, with STEM skills, but they value more highly the interpersonal skills, the non-cognitive skills, and that was what was so interesting. So I would say that that my obsession about social capital is really about, looking back, would say that whom you know is, if not more important than what you know, at least as important. And the thing about good CTE schools is, without making a big fuss and looking for a mentor and sending you to job fairs, you're out in the field in most cases, in a workplace, meeting people that you would not ordinarily meet, and very frequently those experiences outside of school build your social network, strengthen if you know the phrase, the strength of weak ties. They build you a network with people who might not ordinarily be around to help you. So those are the kinds of the things that I look for, and I don't know how much, I didn't look at how much time I had, so.
You still have more if you want.
I do, okay, couple of thoughts. So a couple of interesting things from reading the papers. I wrote to Andy last night as soon as I read the paper. This is great. You're saying all the things, of course, that I believe. One of the interesting things, the reason I mentioned Minnesota, and southern Minnesota, we do a lot of work in rural Tennessee, in other rural areas, is that adults, these communities are graying. And families there who have college-age students are really concerned that those young people will go away. It's from Mankato to Minneapolis is less than 2 hours, that there's a brain drain. And so the focus of employers and community organizations and the nonprofits are, how do we build a regional economy that's strong? And the CTE schools are, in most cases, really stepping up to do that because of this tight relationship. It isn't necessarily a governmental one. It's that we need to come together. The piece that is a big gap, and that the CTE schools in New Jersey are sort of out on the cutting edge about, is the connection between the community college sector and high schools. In too many cases, the mapping from 9th grade through to an associate's degree is vague. It's not seamless. Students waste credits. They don't know what to take. In my organization, Jobs for the Future, we're doing a lot of very, very careful mapping so that a student who starts an allied health program in 9th, 10th grade has the right college courses that keep options open within the allied health field, as opposed to everybody wants to be a doctor or a nurse. They aren't going to all end up being that, and they need to have not just the pre-nursing courses, but a wide variety. So, so a couple of other observations. One of the interesting things that seems to be emerging around this stigma with CTE is, we used to, when we started doing Pathways to Prosperity work, sort of disguise CTE by calling it STEM. Now you really don't have to do that so much anymore, because what you're beginning to see is that we as a society, and this is just a term that I've just learned from reading a Brit's work, a woman named Louise Archer, we're beginning to value what we call science capital, or she calls science capital. And science capital happens in technical programs. So when you're seeing this very positive upswing in health, IT, engineering, you're seeing, without us having to make a big fuss, this development of a culture of science capital. So that seemed to me a very interesting thing that was worth calling out. Final thing that I would say is this issue of social and emotional learning is something that is just beginning to come onto the horizon in K-12. It's a version of what Albert is talking about, but he's also talking about something different and broader. And I'll end by saying, to go back to the Swiss system, you ask a Swiss kid in the vocational system, what are you doing there? And there are three things they say. I learned, I know how to, and I know how to behave. And those three things really constitute a very nice way of thinking about what happens in a vocational school where young people are interacting not just with their peers, but with a wide range of adults. I guess the final thing I would say is my favorite thing. There's a wonderful developmental psychologist named Robert Halpern, who writes a lot about the connection between learning and doing, experiential education, apprenticeship. And I read this and it reminded me of my own 3 teenagers that I've lived through. If you want to keep teenagers from growing up, the best way to do it is lock them up in a school with their peers.
Gary, let's turn to you for some reactions and some thoughts.
Great, thank you. And it's wonderful to be here this morning. I'm having a little bit of deja vu. Until about 10 years ago when I left MPR Associates to form ConnectEd, I did what Nat and Albert and Andy do, and I am so glad to see that it is in such good hands and that you're doing it much better than I ever did. So how many of you have ever taken a career and technical education course? Show of hands. Besides typing or word processing? Same? Okay. So, good. All right, we've got maybe 20% of the room. I would hope that we leave here today, I want to make a plea, that we stop talking about career and technical education in isolation from the rest of the secondary, post-secondary education system. The work that we've been doing in California for the past 10 years and now in many other parts of the country is really focused on making career and technical education an integral part of the high school and now also the post-secondary experience. What do I mean by that? In Link Learning, we like to celebrate student work. At the end of each year now, we bring students and teachers and parents and employers together at an exhibition where students come and they share the projects that they have been working on during the school year. A couple of years ago, I was at an exhibition in Southern California. There was a group of students from the digital media arts pathway at Hollywood High School. And in that pathway, students had been asked in teams of 4 to develop a 2-minute video trailer that they would use to pitch to studio executives in Hollywood. There was one group of 4 students. Their project was to develop a 2-minute trailer for a documentary on the history of racial segregation in Los Angeles. In their English class, they wrote the script for their video, but they also read The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And in their social studies class, they read and they analyzed and they discussed Brown versus Board of Education. And they read the Kerner Report, the 1968 Kerner Report on Civil Disorder. And in their physics class, they studied the properties of light and how lenses work and how cameras work. And in their videography class, their career and technical education class, they learned how to do a storyboard. They learned how to shoot. They learned how to edit and put this all together in this 2-minute video trailer. And they had it, they were showing it there, they had it on a little screen, it was terrific. And I asked them, I said, to whom did you get to pitch this? And they said, oh, we got to pitch it to the vice president of MTV. I said, whoa. What was the most important thing that he told you? And they looked at me and they didn't miss a beat and they said, he told us, spelling matters. And like you, their teachers laughed and they said, you know, we tell them that all the time. But until they heard that from the vice president of MTV, they didn't really believe us. And that, to me, in that little vignette, is everything that a college and career pathway should be. It's delivering challenging college preparatory academics, math, science, English, social studies, world language, and it's connecting it to really challenging career and technical education. And it's creating work-based learning opportunities where students have the opportunity to interact with working adults around real problems, and it's providing the personalized social and emotional supports to the college and career counseling that kids need to go on and be successful in both college and career. The word college gets me into a lot of trouble. I've had a lot of conversations about this. I mean four-year college and university. I also mean two-year.
I've given up. That's what it means.
I mean two-year community college. I mean apprenticeship, where that's appropriate. You know, the math demands in most apprenticeship programs are higher than they are in the nursing program at Vanderbilt University. So, and to me, this is fundamentally about preparing every kid for lasting success in further post-secondary education and career. You cannot make it in today's economy, let alone tomorrow, without some form of post-secondary and, frankly, ongoing lifelong learning. Not going to happen. You're not going to earn a living wage without that happening. What we're seeing in California and now in other places, we're working in Detroit, we're working in Madison, Wisconsin, we've just started working in Boston and Holyoke. When pathways are designed and implemented with fidelity, it's possible to raise student outcomes of all students, especially those furthest from opportunity. And Andy, I so appreciate your calling out the admissions policy of the vocational schools in New Jersey. That, from my perspective, is not necessary, and frankly, it's fundamentally wrong. And when you do this work right, when you really pay attention to the kind of teaching and learning that needs to occur in high-quality pathways, it's possible to make these kinds of opportunities and to raise student achievement on a variety of different outcomes for all kids, and not just some. The easiest way to get good results in a school is to only let in good students. And that is something that, in my view, is just fundamentally wrong. So I really appreciate your calling that out. The last thing I want to say is that public policy, and especially federal policy, the Carl Perkins Act, perpetuates the isolation and segregation of career and technical education from the rest of the secondary and post-secondary experience that students have. In California, and frankly, this is our own doing, it's not the federal regulations that require this, we cannot use Perkins money to do professional development for teams of academic and career and technical education teachers around the kind of integrated learning that we've been talking about. We can't use Perkins money for that because you can't spend Perkins money on academic teachers. This is crazy. But federal policy, state policy is perpetuating the very isolation, segregation of career and technical education that we have been living with now for the past almost 100 years. So, in my view, we've got to take that on. We have got to take that on and begin to break down the separation that has existed in America's high schools and, frankly, post-secondary institutions for a long, long time. You know, it's ironic to me, maybe 20% of you said you'd taken a career and technical education course. But I would point out, for those of you, and probably most of the people in this room have gone to four-year college and university, and if you majored in architecture, if you majored in engineering, if you majored in law, if you majored in education, if you majored in nursing, if you majored in medicine, you were doing career and technical education. That is exactly the kind of integration that I'm talking about. And it strikes me as incredibly ironic that we wait until post-secondary education to deliver that for all kids. Thank you.
Great. That is actually a perfect comment to jump into a sort of a broader conversation with the whole panel. But I want to explore, because this has come up in several points during the last hour, is our definition of CTE too rooted in the past? And because I think you just sort of drew some great pictures about We do workplace learning when we get into higher education, happens in apprenticeships. Nancy, you talked about this about STEM and that the culture of science, and I just would love for the panel to kind of reflect on that. Is our definition of CTE too rooted back in the 70s and 80s and doesn't really reflect the economy and society that we have right now, as well as the education system we have right now?
I can take a quick swing, which is what I saw is the best way that I think policy and practice changes, which is slowly and evolutionarily and without sort of like central people like me telling them how it ought to go. So what I was so interested in New Jersey is, like I had a preconception of what this ought to look like, what we used to call VOTEC programs were. I thought about a lot of welding and carpentry programs, but it turned out in some counties, the biggest employer by far is healthcare. And so in my mind, I knew that there were healthcare clusters in CTE. I didn't realize that in those counties how big the healthcare program was, or in the case I gave about hospitality or about law enforcement. So that wasn't in my preconception, but these counties are evolving to meet that. The other thing is what I discussed at the end, and then this point about the admissions criteria, is I'm ambivalent on this. So let me try my best to channel the people in New Jersey who would defend the program. And I think I believe what they say, but I'd love to hear what other folks say. So on the first score, they would say, yes, we have entrance criteria, but many of our schools aren't really using it. I gave the example of, I think, Sussex County or Somerset County, where the vocational school looks a whole lot like the county as a whole. So they would say, number one, don't get too alarmed about it. Number two, they would say, if we're going to have a school for engineering, we need to know that our incoming 8th graders know algebra. We just have to. How are we supposed to have a high-quality program if we don't test for that on the front end? I think that's a legitimate question. But the third, more philosophical question I think we all have to wrestle with is, as we evolve CTE, and this is very different than what it was in the past, is there space in public education for selective admissions public schools that are catering in many cases to already high-performing, in many cases affluent kids who have every intention of going to college? That's not what the vocational education of yesterday was, but in New Jersey, I could imagine a lot of these families saying, yeah, I live in Bergen County. I don't want to send my kid to a private school. I wish there were a public school option, a choice-based option that would enable my child to do well in engineering, so when he or she ends up going to college for a 4-year program, he or she is ready for it. Why can't there be a selective admissions CTE program in my state in the public education system? I'm somewhat convinced by that. I have a hard time telling them that they're wrong.
So I would just toss the whole thing up in the air and say no more CTE, that everyone starting, I mean, we take 6-year-olds to the firehouse and they learn about what firemen do. Somehow, the older you get, the less you learn about what careers are available. We might take high school kids to a museum, but no one ever talks to them about what curators do. They see the exhibits, which is great. So I think this bigger issue is, given the economy, particularly what Gary's saying about everybody needing some post-secondary credential, we should abandon this whole notion of CTE and say everyone needs to have experience and explore the world of work starting in 1st grade. And what I will say, just by way of, when I was doing this book about learning for careers, I started looking at the fancy high schools in my neighborhood. I looked at Wellesley High School in Massachusetts, and then I went across the country and said, what do they do at Palo Alto High School? Well, these high schools are not certainly known as CTE high schools, but wow, you can learn a lot about a career. They have video labs. Palo Alto High School has about 16 IT and advanced math courses and every kind of connection with post-secondary. You can show up in the morning and say, I'd like a research position with X, and it happens. So, there's this great middle where the lower income kids are still clustered in CTE, in many cases, but the suburban comprehensive high schools and our other comprehensive high schools do almost nothing. So I think the lessons are not that CTE is sort of fixing itself, it's the rest of the schools like some of the schools that Gary's working with in California that are now doing linked learning, that really need some help.
So that's a good question too. When you say the CTE is fixing itself,
Yeah.
I was struck by that with Andy's comments about, particularly since the schools he visited reflected so tightly the society and the economy around and were embedded in community colleges. Is this contributing to some of the trends that you're seeing, that CTE programs are reflecting economic changes at a faster sort of pace than traditional schools?
I don't know. I'm working hard to find out, and I don't have that yet, but I'm quite interested in pursuing it, figuring out this. We're also looking and working down the pipeline on some papers that try and assess whether CTE course taking is sort of aligned to labor market signals. I don't know if we have the granularity to do that. I do find this interesting. I do want to put out just a marker, and this is decidedly non-decisive because I don't know the answer to this. But when you look back at sort of like what old CTE was, generally speaking, it was programs for kids who were not academically inclined to get an on-ramp to the labor force that would work for them. And I worry that in the if we're seeing an academization of CTE programs, that could be good for CTE and really bad for students who are on the left-hand side of the academic distribution. Gary, I understand your concern. Everybody needs a post-secondary degree, and that's true. But, look at the completion rates in community colleges. We have a lot of kids who are going there now that are not completing. So and four-year colleges for that matter. So the question about, is that a viable solution for everyone? I would say, well, it's not today, and it may not be soon. I don't know what the answer to this is, but I am very concerned that by sort of bringing CTE funding and even Perkins funding and sort of bringing it up into the more academic spectrum of students, that we leave less of a focus on students, again, on that sort of left-hand tail of the academic distribution.
Yeah, so these are hard. These are hard issues. They're hard conversations. I started doing this work in 1978. There was no U.S. Department of Education in those days. The National Institute of Education issued an RFP to do a 3-year nationwide study of funding, federal, state, and local funding for vocational education. I was working with Charles Benson, who was the leading school finance expert in the country at the time. We bid on this proposal, never expecting to win, and were shocked when we did. And Charles turned to me and he said, I want to see the very best and the very worst vocational education in the United States. Neither one of us knew anything about vocational education at the time. And he said we can do that by going to one place. What would you guess it was? Any guesses? New York City.
I was just going to say New York City.
And in 1978, we went and we saw some of the worst vocational education I've ever seen. Auto programs that consisted of teaching boys all black how to wash and wax cars. Allied health programs that consisted of teaching girls all black how to change bedpans. But we also went to aviation high school, where the entire curriculum was organized around aviation, engineering, airframe, and power, and where every kid was going on to post-secondary. About half to four-year college, about half to community college where they get their airframe and power certification. We went to Murray Bergstrom School of Business and Commerce down in the heart of the business district, incredible school. And on our last day, we spent the last day at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Yeah. Anybody know it? A 4-year liberal arts degree granting institution, part of the State University of New York. Kids turn down Ivy League schools to go to FIT, and the entire curriculum is organized around the world of fashion. You go into the library at FIT, there's some books, but there's rack upon rack of clothing going back over hundreds of years. And we got back on the plane that night, and Charles, who loved his martinis, and you could get a martini on the plane in those days, has his martini, and he turns to me and he says, Gary, wouldn't it be ironic if it turned out that vocational education were the ugly duckling of school reform? And I think that's what has sort of motivated my work. Henry David, who led that study for the National Institute of Education, was fond of saying, anything you say about vocational education is true. And that's sort of where we are today, frankly. It hasn't changed a whole lot. I mean, I think, Andy, you mentioned the tension between what you're calling sort of traditional career and technical education and the new career. It's deep. I mean, we're fighting that battle in California. And frankly, we made it that way. I mean, to go back to federal policy, the career and technical, and Rick, you'll have to remind me when we finally succeeded in changing this, we used to define career and technical education, vocational education, as preparation for occupations that require less than a baccalaureate degree. I mean, could you imagine a better strategy for saying that career and technical education has second-class status? I mean, we've done this. Now, that's no longer in law, but the legacy is very, very much there. And frankly, it reflects a much deeper issue of the way we view different kinds of work. You know, I promised Sujay I'd plug this book. I guess another plea I would make is, will we please stop talking about middle skills jobs? You know, I'm sure there are a lot of very well-educated people in this room who get completely flummoxed when they have to troubleshoot a problem with their car. I suspect that there's nobody in this room who knows how to miter a crown molding or to make a dovetailed joint that produces really fine furniture. We could have a very interesting debate about who's highly skilled and who's not. But these issues really, I mean, these reflect sort of deep social issues around class and race. And let's not kid ourselves. I mean, that is deeply embedded in the problems that we're discussing here this morning and trying to confront. So,
Thank you, Gary. That's a little too fresh for me. I just tried installing a light switch, and I got the lights to turn off. They wouldn't turn off. The house did not burn down, but that's a little bit. I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and I still couldn't figure it out. Since we've touched on this, or danced around the edges, but we talked a little bit about public policy, and actually sort of public policy in perpetuating sort of the old model and some of these old stereotypes. We have an esteemed panel, but we also have an esteemed audience with a lot of folks here who are in positions of great influence in the administration as well as in Congress. What would you suggest to them be some ways that public policy can remove some of those blockers or to help accelerate some of these pathways that you talked about? And Albert, let's start with you.
Yeah. So let me just mention something, so not for the policymaker, but for just the actual teachers that are actually doing stuff in schools. So I was a former math teacher, and I worked with my department chair back in those days to create an intro to statistics course. And the motivation for creating this course was, well, we had students, they finished Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, but they weren't interested in doing pre-calculus, calculus, nor were they ready for it. And you can imagine, a lot of these students were the ones that showed up to school in their nursing scrubs because, they just weren't that inclined to get into a calculus class or a pre-calculus class. But they were motivated, they were working hard, and we just ran out of math courses for them to give them additional preparation, their junior or senior year. So we designed this intro to stat class that taught them statistics. We built in some review work of what they learned in their previous math courses. And we built in modules where we got them in the computer lab to work with software. You don't need a policymaker to pass some law to mandate any of this. This is perfectly all grassroots stuff, a bunch of teachers getting together to think about what is some way we can address the need that's here and now that we see in our schools. I think there's more that needs to be said about the ability, the potential for people that are actually doing things in our schools to think outside the box to just address immediate needs. So,
Great.
yeah.
I have two specific policy fixes, one for states and one for the feds. So I spent probably the last 15 years working on early college, so integrating high school and college and helping young people get started, particularly low-income people at risk of not going to college, get started earning college credits in high school. And many of the programs that Andy is mentioning and the strongest CTE programs help young people start getting career-focused courses that are college courses in high school. The feds did a small experiment with early Pell. So I think 20 institutions across the country experimented with using Pell for high school students. Given the sparse funding for community colleges at this point, the costs for community colleges and for high schools when both have to either collaborate and draw down money from each of their budgets, or when community colleges are asked to waive tuition, they would be better off being able to use early Pell. I mean, I know all the arguments about why it's a problem, but it's something to consider. How can we better integrate the two systems so that you could, especially since early college students and all the data we have shows that you're likely to complete, so you're not going to end up in debt with no degree, how could we begin to use federal dollars so that you were moving on to college courses in a kind of more competency-based way? The second I would mention is Massachusetts is unique in the country in having a line item in the budget called connecting activities. It came from School to Work in the 90s. It's a small line item. It's about $4 million and unfortunately has declined. It provides workforce development money from the state to the Department of Education, which redistributes it to the workforce development boards to use to support the infrastructure that connects high school students with employers. So Boston, for example, puts 12,000 kids now in summer jobs. The Private Industry Council, which is our workforce board, is the connector. And so this whole issue of state policy that really supports employer engagement and helps with the translation between the workforce system and education is something that is extremely powerful in Massachusetts and absent in most other places. So these connections that you need to have in good CTE programs with employers are very hard to engineer and pay for.
Andy, Nat?
I was involved earlier in my career in what I just look back on and think of as a bunch of policy initiatives that were way too bossy. Like I and other people in central positions of power thought we knew the answer on accountability. We thought we knew the answer on teacher evaluation. And by God, we were going to make people do it because it was in their best interest. I've evolved on that, let's say. In a lot of these cases, it is much smarter, I believe, to recognize America's pluralism and the wide differences of problems and histories and cultures and empower people to do things differently while trying to use a bully pulpit to recognize these challenges that we have. I think CTE is particularly receptive to this second type of distribute, relinquish power because there isn't a national skills gap. There are 100 different skills gaps across different kinds of regions. What Tucson needs right now is different than what Tallahassee needs, and that is going to change. And the idea that Washington, D.C. can figure all that stuff out, or even a state capital, I'm skeptical of that. So the less bossy, more empowering model is actually along the lines of what I think New Jersey did, which is you say, let's enable social entrepreneurs, other entities that are outside of the system to figure out this stuff on their own. And you allow 1,000, 1,000,000 different flowers to bloom. You don't have like Hayek's idea of like a central brain. It doesn't have all of the power. The most intelligence is distributed intelligence. So allow these different communities to do that. Allow counties, allow cities, allow chartering to do this. For example, why don't states use their charter laws to have a preference over the next 10 years to say, you've done great things on urban, college-ready middle schools. Why don't we use our charter law to create a new generation of CTE high schools? So I would allow social entrepreneurialism to use these state laws to create new types of schools. But I want to, like, in parentheses, say the downside in many people's eyes to that, and I think this is a natural consequence of this approach, and I'm willing to assume it, but you have to decide if you are. When you give power to people to do things their way, they're going to do stuff that a lot of you don't like. Are you willing to say that it's okay that Bergen County is going to create selective admissions CTE schools that are serving kids that get 1350 on their PSAT and not really serving kids who aren't going to college? Are you open to the idea that a county will say, we want our kids to stay in the county, so all of the programs we have are going to be directly aimed at county employers, as opposed to saying kids should be mobile and go all across America? This is what pluralism is all about, so I think the only way we solve this problem, open up these laws and allow communities to figure out themselves.
Yeah, I agree with so much of this, but I still retain a concern, and that is that if we give a lot of leeway and local freedom, I would just say that when we make policies about CTE, we should know what we are wanting to spend money on and spend money to a specific purpose. And if we leave that too loose, I am afraid that sort of larger currents in education policy and thought can really shape what CTE becomes. So let me list a few. Tracking became extremely unpopular in the 90s, and that has an effect on sort of the way we think about CTE in a way that we might want to not do CTE because it tracks students into it. That might make it harder for CTE to fulfill its original sort of purpose. The same thing if we academize CTE too much. If we sort of allow the schools in New Jersey that have, 17,000 on their PSAT, this is sort of fine, but it's a different thing that we are doing. And if we move, a couple of other large sort of education movements. College for all, an extremely powerful idea that will move CTE if it's sort of given a lot of leeway to move based on local decisions. Just as long as the wind is blowing towards college for all, CTE will become more and more for college-going kids. And that leaves behind, potentially, again, students that we stereotypically think about. I mean, if you can think about, I think of Welcome Back, Kotter. I don't know if any of you know this television show. I think about those kinds of students that are stereotyped there. Those students need to be well served, and they're not well served by our education system. So,
I want to address the academic.
It's tough, isn't it? I like that.
So,
copyright.
When the James Irvine Foundation came to us 10 years ago, at that time, they wanted to advocate for more academically rigorous career and technical education. They saw that as a strategy for addressing very high rates of dropping out in California's big urban school districts. And we said, that's probably not the wisest thing to do. Because, Nat, as your data point out, high school students have never taken more than about 4 career and technical education courses. I mean, yeah, it's gone from 4 to 3, but they never took more than 4. And we said, look, if you don't do something about the other 22 courses that kids are taking in high school, we're going to continue to see the high rates of dropping out and failure in not only further education, but in career. And so to me, it's about getting more real-world application into the core academics. It's about real, authentic, multidisciplinary, project-based learning where kids in math and science and English and social studies are working on real-world problems that help them better understand, why do I need to know this? It's a fair question. And we don't give kids very good answers. And because I say so, may work as a parent, but it doesn't work as a teacher. And so it's about making academics more accessible and more possible and more attainable for more kids by changing the way we do learning and teaching.
Great. So we're going to invite you to join us in the conversation now. 4 requests as part of the Q&A. 1, that you wait for a mic. We have some mic roamers. 2, state your name, the organization, just for the people joining us online. And be sure to ask a question. So not a statement, a question, and just because we're short on time, make it a quick question. So any questions? Yes, we'll start here and then we'll go in the back after.
Excellent discussion. Brings back a lot of memories, deja vu kinds of things with some of the folks I've known for a while. One thing I learned when I was...
Name and organization.
I'm sorry, I'm Barry Stern. I'm education and workforce development consultant working in collaboration with the Haberman Educational Foundation. One thing I learned as a deputy assistant secretary for the CTE program, and Gary remembers me there, two things, and I'm not sure I have a scientific background for it, but I'd be interested in the reaction of the panel. Two things I learned was that the kids who have an earlier career orientation were more likely to end up in CTE, and they did better. Someone with some direction seemed to do better than people who didn't have direction. And the best CTE programs I saw around the country were those where the head of CTE for a school district was a deputy superintendent or an assistant superintendent, not buried way down in the bureaucracy. This brings me to something that Gary had said. Bill Honig, former superintendent of schools in California, called me up one day and he said, we'd like to use the CTE money, the Perkins Act money, to reform our high schools. And we talked a bit about that, and I said, you know, if it were me, I'd let you do it. Your point. But I can't do it. What would your advice be to me back then, in 1991 maybe, or today, or actually changing the Perkins Act? Should we be allowed to use Perkins money to kind of redirect and do what Gary says, infuse more real-world stuff in the general curriculum so that kids get engaged and want to be there?
Great. Who wants to take that?
Yes.
Good. Does anyone?
I don't mean to be flippant. Now, Barry, I mean, the problem you raise is real. I actually, and I can say this now, you know, as I've gotten older, I've gotten dumber, but I can just sort of say what I think. So I do. I think we ought to get rid of the Perkins Act. You know, we need a high school redesign act or a secondary, post-secondary, college and career pathways act that stops this kind of isolation and segregation and very programmatic approach to issues that are really much more comprehensive and much more systemic. Do I think we're going to get there anytime soon? No.
Great. We had another question in the back here.
Hi, my name is Anna Pope. I'm with the McKeon Group. I had a question also relating to the isolation of CTE programs. I went to high school in Fairfax County down the road in Virginia, and in order to take a class in mechanics, you had to bus from my area at Langley to a less affluent school, Marshall. So what are your thoughts about the isolation of those programs not being available in one school versus another, and the social economic barriers that are also implicit in that issue?
There are various, as Andy was saying, various structures for CTE across the country. And there are even more extreme examples of what you're talking about in Rhode Island. There's the vocational schools and the comprehensive high schools are in the same building, and the culture of the school prevents you from walking across the hall. I don't know the answer to this one because it's not possible for all high schools to have the kind of equipment and access to the kinds of teaching, which we haven't talked about, but there's a huge shortage of CTE teachers. I really don't know the solution. I mean, I've been giving a solution that's kind of an idealist solution, which is that all high schools should have some form of partnerships. Whether in Massachusetts, for example, there's a lot of collaboration between the community colleges that often have a manufacturing lab, for example, and a high school that doesn't. There's a partnership now between Worcester Tech, which is a fantastic vocational school, and the other high schools in Worcester, so students go back and forth. But I don't know the solution.
Let me just add something to that. So there's a nice network of Catholic schools, the Cristo Rey Network, that does this.
Yeah.
Now, they have an issue where they can't do CTE for things, the engineering type things. I mean, it's just too expensive for them.
Yeah.
But what they've realized is, well, we've got a lot of networks to Catholic hospitals and healthcare, the healthcare industries through that, through those means. So it's not, it's not some broad solution, but I
Yeah.
do think that schools and your just districts in general ought to be considering, well, what other networks do we already have that are there that we can leverage?
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to get everything, but there's room for a ton of thought and innovation there, I think.
Can I just add two quick things on this? Just anecdotes from the visits. First of all, you have to appreciate how difficult the job of any principal is, but how extraordinarily difficult the job of a principal of a CTE high school can be, because they have to worry about all of the stuff at a traditional high school, which is a lot, and then have to worry about all of the CTE things. So one of the principals mentioned in passing, yeah, we're doing this, we're doing that. Oh yeah, yesterday I had to replace that $18,000 blender, and oh yeah, we have to replace the paint booth for our automotive group. Oh yeah, now let me tell you about the English classes that we're running. So like the infrastructure necessary to do this is just absolutely enormous. And like this is like the cost question. I don't know how you make this many options available in every single high school. I mean, there is either like a gigantic wing dedicated to carpentry in a school, or there is not. And if you want to have that in every single high school, man, you got to get ready for $30,000 per kid across the nation. But I just want to underscore how hard it is to lead these schools. It's no small task.
We haven't mentioned it, but there is all of a sudden quite a lot of excitement around apprenticeship and youth apprenticeship. That is not going to solve the problem for everyone, but it certainly is a use of resources where students are getting their hands-on training within a company rather than in their school.
Great. We are going to continue this conversation on a next panel. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break just to reset the stage. Will you join me in just thanking our panelists?
All right, could you please take your seats? All right, we're about to begin the second panel, which is focused on community colleges and career and technical education. I will introduce the panelists in a minute. I have the privilege of saying something about me and my work, of course. Why would I give up the opportunity? So my name is Mark Schneider. I'm a Vice President Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research, and I have an affiliation with this august institution, AEI. I've been working with many states through a company called College Measures, which is part of AIR. And we've been looking at the degrees of value and finding pathways through colleges and universities into high productive, high paying, high rate of return programs in colleges and universities. Rooney Columbus, who is lurking in the background over there, and I published a paper a couple of weeks ago called Degrees of Opportunity, in which we looked at some of the College Measures data and identified the programs with the highest ROI. We called it Degrees of Opportunity, but it really should have been called It's Skills, Stupid. Because every program that has the highest rate of return across the states that we've identified and that I've worked with in College Measures are very much skills-based. And many of them are two-year technical degree programs from community colleges, and some are certificate programs. And it is remarkable how high the rate of return is for many of these CTE programs in community colleges. And I'm also working on a paper that's called Saving the AA Degree, working with data from Burning Glass and the work from College Measures. And it really addresses the incredible issue of the schizophrenia in community colleges, which run both junior colleges, transfer programs, versus career and technical, occupational. The names vary from state to state. And we know that about 40% of degrees in the United States, associate degrees in the United States, are in one field, liberal arts and general studies. Again, the zip code is liberal arts, general studies, and humanities. 40% of degrees are in that, and if you look at other transfer-related degrees like an associate degree in history or associate degree in philosophy, we're up to somewhere around half of the degrees granted by community colleges are in liberal arts. So these are clearly designed as transfer programs, and we know, in fact, that many students do not transfer, and many students who do transfer don't end up with a bachelor's degree. So working with the data, both with state data and with the work from Burning Glass, we've identified what is, in fact, a huge wage penalty for students getting an AA degree in humanities and liberal arts compared to their peers that are getting AAS degrees or AS degrees or occupational focused certificates. So for a long time, community colleges were the bastard children of higher education. It was like CTE wrote big, right? And there were all these campuses over there, and someone asked how many people had ever taken a CTE course. I could ask the same question, like how many people here have ever taken a course in a community college? Okay, probably about the same percent. How many of you have a degree from a community college? Yeah. So we live in a world in which you're going to meet many more people with PhDs than with associate degrees, right? I mean, that's the world that we live in, and so community colleges are for other people's children, and and do something different. And then a few years ago, all of a sudden, community colleges became a bright shiny object, and they begin to be recognized as maybe the single largest career and technical education providers in the nation. And we are in the process of recognizing that role and working to try to figure out how to make that role more successful and better. So the panel is actually a perfect opportunity to explore those issues. And I'm going to do a very quick introduction. I don't even know if we have their bios floating around, but as I say, they need no introduction, right? so I won't give him one. So Tamar Jacoby is going to present a paper. We had 2 papers scheduled. Diane Jones actually took a job with the Department of Labor in the apprenticeship program. She's an expert on apprenticeships. And in the weird world of ethics, government ethics, they ruled that she could finish the paper, she could publish the paper, but she couldn't talk about it. As I said, who knows? So Tamara's going to give a paper. Scott Rawls is going to, who's the president of Northern Virginia Community College president, previously the president of North Carolina Community College System. I've known Scott for many years. Unbelievably wonderful president, and look forward to hearing his comments. And actually, I don't know Von Ton Quinlivan from the Community College System of California. Obviously, a big, giant, powerful system and person. And what we're going to do is we're going to let Tamar give a 10 or 12-minute talk about her work, and then there'll be commentary. I'll ask a few questions of this smaller panel than we had an hour ago, and then we'll just turn it open to the floor.
So thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to AEI for publishing the paper, and it's great to be here. So I'm a little shy about giving this paper in front of Scott Rawls and Van Ton Quinlivan because, the research in the paper is basically interviews. I mean, my experience in the past in community college and interviews with about 24 community college educators and state officials, and Scott and Von were 2 of the most interesting people I interviewed, and people doing 2 of the most interesting things in their college and their states. And so it's a little like flying in, and I have this experience a fair amount, flying into a place that you don't know, where you've never been before, and talking to a local audience and telling them about that place. I mean, it's like, it can never go well. The audience is always going to know more than you know. So with that caveat, I mean, we're kind of, AI gave me this this jury. Here we are. So I start from a problem. I started the project from a problem, and it wasn't like how are community colleges. It wasn't like what are the best community colleges, what are the worst community colleges, what can we fix? The problem I start with, and I apologize for the term, Gary, I know I also have qualms about the term, was the middle skills gap. And middle is we need to come up with a new thing that doesn't call them middle skills. Maybe we should call them the higher skills gap or something. But it's it's jobs for people who have more than a high school diploma and less than a 4-year degree. And that's a big category of people, and we got to talk about it somehow. And my question I face is, what do we do about those people? And estimates of how much of the job market is middle skills. It's some people low end is 37, high end is 53%. So it's this is not just a few people off in the hospital or the welding place. 45% of the jobs that earn 35K or more are middle skills, and everybody knows kind of supply is not really keeping up with demand. Employers are constantly complaining, and there's 6.1 million job openings. It's almost 1 for every unemployed person. And the point is, people are waking up to this around the country, right? I'm not the first person you've heard this from. I hear it at every conference I go to, every panel I go to. People are waking up to it. But the point is, there's no easy fix. It's not like if we just spent a lot more money, or we had better leadership, or we all cared a little more, we could fix it. There's a lot of things wrong with the system. Employers aren't good at signaling what skills they need. Employers and educators don't really communicate very well. We don't spend enough money, and what we spend poorly. So there's not just one thing. It's not just like one Marshall Plan. But to me, one of the most challenging questions, and this is what brought me to community colleges, is if we're going to do this on a much broader scale in the country, what institution is going to do it? Who? And right now we don't actually have that effective an institution, right? Or an institution that's doing it, uniformly all that well. So I really only have one significant slide. I'm not a slide person, but this is the slide. So, if you ask the man sitting next to you on the airplane, what about career education, whatever you want to call it, but workforce education is what I often call it. I think, a lot of people, their first answer would be coding boot camps. Well, look at how many people in America are in coding boot camps, about 18,000. Next answer that the man is probably going to give you, the man next to you on the airplane or the bar, wherever you ask people questions like this, is going to be apprenticeship. So look at the number of people in apprenticeship. about 500,000, and that's kind of a generous count. The public, and the point is not that coding boot camps and apprenticeship are bad. Apprenticeship is the gold standard of career education, but it's still a niche market. And we hope it will grow into more than a niche market. There are a lot of people working on that, but right now it's still a niche market. Public workforce system, which is over in the middle there, that's the government jobs program in America. Right? 161,000 trained in the most recent year. And, a lot of people pass through the public workforce system, but they get mostly counseling and how to look for a job and how to interview. That's actually the number of people who train. And so, what's the big bar? Where are the students? Community college. And so, that's the big bar on the right. And the point is, it's not that community college is already right now the right answer, right? Because, this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the story. Because community colleges have a lot of issues, as everyone who ever talks about them knows. And I'm going to focus on just two kinds of the problems really quickly. I want to get to the solutions, but let's just look at that two parts of that bar. The dark blue part of the bar at the bottom, those are what we call credit students, right? And so there's 7.2 million of them. And those are students taking credit-bearing courses, aiming for degrees, and as Mark pointed out, most community colleges focus on those kids. The goal is get kids to four-year college. Everybody has what Mark calls a bachelor's addiction. And so colleges focus a lot of their attention and their effort on that. And all the pressures they face, the metrics, the funding, what the students want, what the parents want, it all drives toward that because everybody's got a bachelor addiction. And the problem is, it doesn't always pay off that well. As Mark's research shows, but just two numbers, fewer than 40% of community college kids earn any kind of credential in 6 years. Like not a bachelor's, not an associate's, and not even a certificate, right? So they're not doing that job very well. And another sort of heartbreaking number is that 80% of students enter community college thinking they're going to transfer, but only, and there's a little division about what the number is, but it's somewhere between 12 and 17% ever make it. It's almost a distinction without a difference. So 80% want it, only max 17% make it. So there's a lot more to talk about over there, and other people will do it. Diane Jones was supposed to do it, she's not here. But let's talk for a minute about the light part of the bar. So the light part of the bar, most people in America don't even know about, right? The light part of the bar is what's called non-credit community college education. And look so the number there, the estimate is 5 million. The truth is we know so little about community college, non-credit community college, we don't even have a number. Like people in the community college world say the number could be 5 million, could be 8 million. The American Association of Community College has been estimating 5 million for many years. Like they just don't know. And the point is, it's a really interesting part of the college, right? So it includes a lot of, I won't call it junk, but it includes a lot of recreational courses, photography for adults in the evening and English as second language and stuff like that. But a lot of it is workforce education. And it's people who want to come back to college and learn a skill, and they're usually relatively quick and dirty courses, and these people don't want to take English, and they don't want to take math, and they want to learn what they want to learn how to do, and they learn it quickly, and they go back to work, usually. And, some people call non-credit the hidden college, and it's often looked down upon or ignored by other people in the institution and by policymakers, right? To the point that we don't even know how many students are there. But it has a lot of advantages, and I'm going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. Advantages for workforce education, right? They know employers. What a lot of them have been doing for all their existence is working with employers to provide what's called customized training, and they know employers, and they know how to work with employers, and they can speak employer, which a lot of community college people can't. Their tradition is workforce education, so they don't look down on it. Maybe most important, they're a lot more flexible because they don't have to get the courses through the academic governance committee, right? So they can stand up a course really quickly and they can talk to the employer, well, you don't need welding anymore, now you need lasers, and they can switch and ditch welding and put on the lasers. And they can't do that in the academic side. So there's a lot of promise there, a lot of unrealized potential. They also have disadvantages, right? They're way underfunded. You can't use your federal financial aid, mostly, almost universally. And because they're separate and looked down upon, the assets that they bring, the good relationships with the employers and stuff, often don't get connected to the other side of the community college. So they're having good relations with employers, but the rest of the community college is having kind of perfunctory relations with employers. And it is an issue about credit, right? If these kids want to eventually move on, which we want them to do, we want them to eventually decide they want credit and they want certificates and they want whatever, it can be sometimes hard to bridge. And so that's a big issue, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. So, bottom line, again, for community college, imperfect institution, lots of problems, but huge potential in my view. So, I think it's a job for the states, and I'm going to talk about a bunch of states. Many more states are doing it than that, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the states I mentioned in my paper. I think there are 2 left out of there, actually. But the point is it's kind of a ferment. And I'm going to look at 5 levers. And I'm not going to talk about all these levers, but just, so you have them there. State leadership is really important. It's very hard for one college alone to say we're going to change our mission and we're going to do all kinds of different things and we're going to connect with employers. Sometimes that happens, but usually it's the state that drives it, and can be soft and hard power, but it is really important. Funding is obviously important. Data is obviously really important. Lifelong learning is important for the reason I just mentioned, because if you're going to do this well and be successful at it and it's going to work for the country and the students, it can't just be you do this stuff and this is the end of it. You have to be able to translate it later into a credential if you want that, or another credential, or learning on the job. And the last thing is engaging employers. And you've heard this mentioned a bit already on the other panel, but the sort of truth of the new workforce education, the new CTE, the new voc ed, whatever you want to call it, is there's no effective workforce education without employers. It's the best way, maybe the only way, to guarantee that the students are actually preparing for real-time existing in-demand jobs, right? And the jargon that they use in the field is, without employers, it's train and pray. Like, you train them at something, you teach them something, and you pray that there will be a job when they're finished. And believe me, in the past there was a lot of praying and unanswered prayers. But the point is, it can be hard to engage employers. Employers are from Mars, educators are from Venus. They don't know each other, they have very different cultures, they speak very different languages, and it's hard for community colleges. Where do I even find the right employers? And it can be hard for a state. How can a state from far away help the community college connect with employers? We heard one example from Massachusetts this morning, but it's hard. So I'm just going to tell 3 stories. We're done with the levers. Read the paper if you want to hear about the other levers. I'm going to tell 3 stories. 3, I think, exciting experiments and initiatives that are going on out there across the country. And let's go back to the map. That'll be sort of a good background. And it'll give you a sense of kind of what's happening, what the ferment is, and also a sense of what can be done. So the first story comes out of California. And so, in most schools, high schools, colleges, 4-year colleges, any place, people who don't finish are seen as a problem, right? Dropouts. In colleges, they call them non-completers. And the colleges consider them failures, systems consider them failures, colleges lose money when people don't complete. It's a big problem. And sometimes they are failures. They're inadequately prepared, they get distracted by their job or their family, and they don't finish, they get confused by too many options, whatever. There are a lot of reasons to drop out of college, millions do. But I think it was a little more than 5 years ago, a researcher in California discovered a whole different category of non-completers. These were older students who'd come back to college. They were often working already in a technical field. They came back to college. They took 1 or 2 courses in their field. They did really well in those courses, and then they dropped out. And guess what this researcher found? He traced them back to the workforce. They make about 15% more when they get back to the workforce. They were learning something really focused that was going to help them get a raise or a better job. And the question is, what can we learn from that, right? What does that tell us about the skills that are in demand, about how people learn over their lifetimes, but most important, about what's wrong with the way we're designing and measuring and funding our community colleges, right? If those people are the failures and schools are losing money on those people, you could say there's something wrong with the schools or the people, but I think there's something wrong with the measures. So really interesting thing going on in California. Now that research is also being done in other states. Peter Riley Barr is the researcher. Thing number 2, funding. So there's no escaping. We saw some numbers early on. Workforce education is expensive. The equipment costs more, nurses' dummies cost in the nearly $100,000, the good ones. Robotic welders are in the, high, whatever, six figures. The instructors, number two, the instructors cost more. Ideally you want to hire some people out of industry, right? Like not just the teachers that have been teaching that same, whatever it is, forever. You want to hire some people who just worked in the field. They're expensive. They expect to earn more than community college faculty. And the student ratios have to be much more, better ratios. It's really hard to teach, welding or nursing in a lecture hall. Eventually you have to get down to that one-on-one, one-on-5, whatever it is. So it's expensive. One estimate I found said that technical programs cost 3 or 4 times as much as a liberal arts class, and I'm guessing that's an underestimate. But the problem is most states don't care. Or they, they're oblivious to it, they don't care, who knows what the problem is. They pay for seat time, sort of whatever, it's about showing up, it's not about what you're learning, how expensive it is. There's often no extra money for skills education for the extra expenses. And there's often really no money or much less money for non-credit, again, where sometimes some of the best courses are. So, I'd like to start, because this is a great punchline, how ideally would you fix that? Well, you would have more money for in-demand skills. You would have more money for the expensive programs that teach to in-demand skills, not any old expensive programs, but the ones that teach to in-demand skills. And you would have money for non-credit programs that teach to in-demand skills. Well, how rare is it that some policy wonk thinks about what would be the ideal thing, and then you look out in the world and you find it? Well, Scott Rawls did it. Scott Rawls built it. And when he was in North Carolina, and he has all the political scars to prove it, and he'll, I hope, tell you a little bit about that battle, because it's not easy to say we're going to upset the old apple cart of the way we funded things and fund it a different way, where people who didn't used to get money get the money. And I'll leave it to him to tell you about the battle. But the short version is, and he'll, again, this is where I'm getting into dangerous territory, because he'll tell me I'm wrong, but it's a tiered funding formula. And there are basically 4 tiers. It's still full-time equivalent funding, right? So it's still funding for dollars for hours spent in class. It's not sort of, there is a performance-based thing going on in North Carolina too, but this is not that. But there's more dollars per hour if you're teaching in-demand skills. There's more dollars if the program costs more to deliver. And the non-credit divisions that prepare people for in-demand skills are on a par with the credit divisions that do that, right? Exactly what you would like to see. So it's a radical idea. North Carolina is the only state that's doing it. Very exciting in my view. So last story, and I don't know, I am just a little over time, brings us back to this first principles, which is this absolute must-have secret sauce differentiator of the new workforce education, which is employer engagement. And more or less everybody in the field recognizes now employer engagement is the key thing. But, and with all due respect, right, to a lot of people working on this around the country, I would argue that a lot of programs that claim to be employer-driven or have employers involved, it's pretty much a check-the-box exercise. I'm saying it's many, I'm not saying all at all, there's some very good ones, but there's an employer somewhere in the picture, but it's not really a meaningful relationship. And so, what does a meaningful relationship look like in my view? It's employers really know the college, real relationship. Employers explain to the college what skills they need. Colleges listen to the employers, actually, and then, redesign curricula, adjust curricula. And then the employer hires the graduates, not because some law tells them to, but because the graduates now actually have the skills he wants. And again, the problem is it's real hard to build that kind of relationship and really hard for states to drive it. So again, I'm going to turn to North Carolina, and this program predates Scott, so I don't have to feel too guilty, although he does probably know more about it than me. But, and just really quickly, essentially what North Carolina does is it creates incentives for companies creating new jobs in the states to do their training at community colleges rather than somewhere else, because the money actually flows to the community colleges instead of the companies. And what this does is it's a kind of matchmaking is my metaphor for it. Like it's kind of the state sets you up sort of on what I would call your first date. It introduces the college and the company, and they do some first small step together. And then what happens often is because they get to know each other and they see each other's strengths and they see the advantages that the other bring and that the synergy brings, they build the relationship independently of the government funding. And I've seen this again and again in North Carolina and other places. The ties grow and deepen. The consultation and collaboration get closer, about the real details that matter. And the partnership often lasts for years after the funding stops. So there's a nice little example in my paper, a little college in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina and a big global aerospace company, but you can read the paper. What I want to say in closing is just to put this in perspective, community colleges are not the perfect institution. Please do not get me wrong, by any means. You know, they're by sort of definition, they're small, they're modest, they're local, and a lot of them are struggling. I mean, really struggling. And they don't have that great a track record, right? The completion rates are abysmal. But they do, in my view, really have great potential. And I see this as a challenge for policymakers, right? And policy wonks and the people in this room, is how do we create the incentives for these colleges to live up to that potential? You know, how do we sort of a combination of carrots and sticks and kicks in the pants and whatever it's going to take to shape up and, in my view, rethink their core mission? Because, you know, goodness knows, we as a nation, I come back to my central point, need a scalable provider of workforce education, and community colleges are our best bet.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot about North Carolina, but I think we're going to hear maybe more about Nova, which is one of those small regional community colleges. I think that was a mischaracterization of many of the colleges. But anyway, so Scott, why don't we just have some comments from you, and then we'll go to Van.
All right, well, first, thank you. Tamar gave me way too much credit for things, but I appreciate it. Like most college presidents, you get a lot more credit for things you didn't do and a lot of blame for stuff you didn't do as well, so that's just the way it works. But thank you for the opportunity to be here. I thought I would just build off a few of the comments, things that I think are important, sometimes things I think that when you look at CTE, and for us, CTE and community colleges is typically our applied programs, what we would call our applied associate programs, now becoming sometimes applied bachelor programs, certificates, certifications, degree, non-degree. That's our CTE world. But I thought I'd hit on a few things that oftentimes I don't think unless you get under the hood, you really see. One is this issue around funding. And I have been passionate about this issue about funding, and frequently will say, as I did to a congressional hearing just a couple of weeks ago, that I think the biggest gap, I believe that the biggest gap between rhetoric and investment in education is in technical education. Now, I don't know that for a fact, I just know it's true. But there is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of people who really want to see more and more technical education, but there's not a lot behind that funding that follows behind that discussion. And I think what gets missed a lot is how much it does cost. So I thought I'd just give a few examples and why it's important to look differently. One is instructor costs. Now, Northern Virginia Community College, we're the biggest college this part of the country. Our biggest program, our biggest CTE program, if you called it that, is cybersecurity. It's grown from 50 students 4 years ago to almost 1,500 today. There are a variety of costs in different kinds of programs, but the more technical your program is, and a lot of times the more technical your program is, the more high demand that program is for employment, and then leads to student demand. It also has much higher costs. So think about instructors. We hire our instructors at about 2/3 the average cost for average wages in the industry. Our highest level instructors are employed at about 2/3 the industry. That's just the levels at which we hire. When we bring them in, we make them even more competitive. That's something that often happens with many community colleges, because a lot of times we're bringing people in that have very, very strong industry experience, but we also try to embed, as we do with cybersecurity, alternative credentials all the way through, certifications. So, we're teaching Security Plus. We're teaching Certified Ethical Hacker. Our instructors have to gain those certifications oftentimes, even though they have the skills to be able to teach and know what the students need to get. We make them more competitive, and then we want them to be, embedded with industry, talking to industry. So we're taking very underpaid people, giving them highly competitive certifications, and then putting them out there in front of all of our industries. So what happens? Frequently, we lose instructors. So we have to find ways to pay more. One of the things we're trying to do, we have our first, we started in cybersecurity, endowed professorships, endowed instructors. Well, we're trying to make up that gap. We're not trying to get to the industry. We're just trying to get close enough that people will stay with us. But that's a huge gap, and that's a huge challenge, and that's where policies such as where states can match funding that corporate may give can help in those regards. Equipment. We often say in cybersecurity, a cybersecurity lab is really a kid in the basement with a laptop and a can of Red Bull. That's not truly the way it is. I mean, the thing about cybersecurity, like other labs, they're lab-based and they're expensive. So we have to separate our cybersecurity labs from our networks, which is not as easy as it sounds, so that they can actually be cybersecurity labs. That takes support, that takes expense. And then another area is class size. Often these programs have much smaller class sizes. And sometimes these programs, and you'll find sometimes the most high demand programs, and this is a real challenge that people don't talk about, are still very, very male dominated. In fact, over recent decades have become even more male dominated. So when you talk about technician programs, when you talk about machining programs, when you talk about computer programming, they've even become more male dominated over a period of time. And the truth is, we have fewer and fewer males that are getting past high school into college, and that affects community colleges. Our populations are often 2/3 female. And so you will see in a lot of programs that are male-dominated, they're at 2/3 capacity, and we're doing everything we can to raise capacity. But sometimes policymakers will look and say, well, you have these programs that have low class sizes, but they're just exactly the high-demand programs you're trying to ramp up. Cost is important, so that's why I say, at the state level, when you're just funding everything the same and you're not looking at it, you're not thinking about those extra costs. Federal funding, what's the biggest federal funding source? Perkins CTE. Just let me tell you, our college, we have total budget from everything, grants, tuition, state, auxiliary services, is $332 million this year. We're the 14th largest college of any size in the country. Our total Perkins CTE allocation this year is $413,000. If I remember correctly, we could probably buy a really good CNC multi-axis machine. But when we start talking about the impact, you have to keep that in mind. That's why I say there's a huge difference between rhetoric and funding. One other thing to keep in mind is metrics. Now, community colleges are sometimes, we suffer about where we fit in higher ed. Sometimes when people talk about higher ed, they don't talk about community colleges because, or they'll say, sometimes they'll forget and say, oh, and higher ed and the community colleges. Now, one time they always count community colleges as when they're making cuts to higher ed. I've always noticed that any time there are cuts to higher ed, you don't have to check to see if you're included. You're automatically included. But metrics are important. And I know it was talked about our completion rates in the previous panel, but I don't pay any attention to our federal completion rates. Because even in the transfer side, I remember a student in North Carolina who was the valedictorian for NC State, who went to the community college to start with, but like most community college students, transferred early. So he, for us, is a non-complete failure while he's the valedictorian at NC State University. But this also hits very heavily in CTE, particularly the more relevant alternative credentials and certifications are in CTE. And let me tell you a personal experience. So when I was president in North Carolina, I went around the state talking about graduation rates, talking about how we need to improve completion. And I got to way far out in the Smoky Mountains, our most western college, way deep in the mountains, that had a very large welding program, much larger than the jobs that existed there. But people were learning welding and moving on around the world to weld at primarily energy plants all around the world. And then they'd come back to the mountains and live for 3 months and then go back out. Now, the instructor or the department chair was making the presentation, and he said, I know you've been looking at all our statistics about graduation rates. So our graduation rate in welding for the past few years has been 8%. He said, I need to give you some supplemental data. And he had every pay stub from his last two graduating classes and said, and if you look in there, you'll see one where they're making more money than the college president's making right now. Now, what the point was is they were earning along the way certifications, very valuable certifications. And sometimes I would joke, our worst welding instructors are the ones who actually graduate because they haven't been hired yet. Now, when we start to look at metrics and how those are challenges that we don't take into consideration. There are programs that we have that are not funded. Just let me give you a couple examples. This year, with a boot camp, we recruited to work with a boot camp, partnered with the boot camp to help fund. It was a major boot camp. They've just gone out of business, so it's sort of the boot camps are going up and down. But we kind of self-funded ourselves with private funding and other sources, a boot camp for veterans. And every one of those veterans, I think, now is employed in good jobs, but none of those students will reflect in any algorithm that will provide any additional funding, state or federal, to our college. We do the Amazon apprenticeship program. To be in one of those apprenticeship programs, the Veterans Apprenticeship Program, you have to have a bachelor's degree and have IT experience as a vet before you can go into the 16-week apprenticeship training part that we provide before they go on the job training at Amazon. None of those folks will show up in any algorithm that will lead to extra funding to our college. And that's sometimes where community colleges get mixed. The more high-tech some of our programs are, a lot of times students who come to us already have bachelor degrees. Healthcare's that way, technical's that way, biotech programs are that way. It is something that's out there. Something I'll leave for later, but I think one of the things that should be discussed more are connections. Community colleges sit in a very unique place. We are the seam in seamless education. We have to have these tight fits with employers, but the fastest growing area of community colleges is dual enrollment, and there's a lot more strategy that should take place about how dual enrollment, and particularly dual enrollment pathways, tie into high school, and a lot of times that is not thought about nearly enough as a strategy. And then we also need to talk about the strategies of connecting to universities, because more and more HR departments require bachelor's degrees to be employed. 85% of the IT jobs in our region require a bachelor's degree. There was data that just showed from Burning Glass that last year, I think it was over 2/3 of the production supervisors required a bachelor's degree to be employed, although only 19% of all production supervisors have a bachelor's degree. But what that means is to more and more in areas to supervise or to be a manager or to move up, you have to have a bachelor's degree, even if to get the skills you don't have a bachelor's degree. And that's some complexity, and you see more and more universities offering applied type programs, and you see more and more community colleges moving up and offering applied bachelor's programs, and there's not a whole lot of policy discussion and strategy around that. And that's something I think that needs further consideration. So with that, I'll be quiet.
Great. So I just want to comment about the data issue. So I used to head NCES. So we have been trying to improve data, right, especially about community colleges, predated when I got there in 2005. And I mean, it has been, I don't know if you know about the Gemina program, somewhere along the line, the government recognized that had no information about certificates, the fastest growing post-secondary credentials. So they started an interagency workforce. They probably spent 5 years trying to figure out how to get the capital I in the middle of Gemina. And it took about 10 years before they got 3 questions that somehow are supposed to expand our information about certificates. So don't worry, Scott. We're taking care of the data needs. It's like a rapid fire. Van?
So good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. So Van Toon Quinlivan, Vice Chancellor of Workforce and Digital Futures of the California Community Colleges. Now, we have 114 community colleges, so one of the largest, if not the largest, higher education system in the country, and serve 2.1 million students. Now, prior to coming here into this role, I was actually on the private industry sides, where I headed up workforce development for a company of 20,000 men and women. And in that role, I took the company from having no opinion in workforce development to becoming one of the nationally recognized industry best practice. So I'm one of those translators that Tamar talked about. So over the last 5, 6 years, California heard the call to action to close the skills gap. And our policy goal is to provide the skilled workers that fuel regional economies, but also to advance social mobility. So those are our dual policy goals. And what we recognize is also that the gateway into the workforce has really changed, and that the high school degree is no longer the gateway, right? You need some kind of post-secondary credential. The country over the last 30 years created roughly 63 million more jobs, but if you have a high school degree or less, there's 2 million less jobs for you. So this is a situation where if you don't have the credential, you're not going to get the interview. If you don't get the interview, you're not going to get the job, right? So in terms of access and opportunity, there's a very important role that the systems play, and especially in this area of the middle skill credentials. We all look at Gary when we say that.
We need a new name. What's the
yes,
new
yes.
name?
Yes.
Skilled technical workforce.
It's a little too long.
So, California needs 1 million more bachelor and above. But equal in size is the middle skills, where you're trained either the certificates, the associates, or some type of post-secondary credential. There's about 3.4 million good jobs, according to Anthony Carnevale's recent research that got released this week, just in California alone in this area. But 30 million of these jobs across the nation. Now, I think part of our role is to kind of give you a little depth and breadth of what are these jobs. Okay, so let's imagine for a moment you leave here, you get into your Uber or your Lyft car, and you get into an automotive accident. Everybody who touches you from that moment on will be trained in these middle skill credentials, right? The emergency medical technician, who's the first responder, the people who check you in at the hospitals, the people who check out your insurance information, take your stats, read your vitals. Everybody up to the point in which the physicians touch you, and then on your way out are all trained through these certificates and degrees. In the middle of the night, you have a big storm, your power line goes out. Who do you call? The people who come and restore your electrical systems or climb those poles, they're all trained through these credentials. So that gives you a thought. And it wasn't until the data came out on the earning power of some of these career technical education programs that we began to shift the dialogue, especially in California. What we saw by looking at the wage of students, so we compared what students were earning 2 years before they completed compared to 2 years and 5 years afterwards. So on average, if someone took a general education associate's degree, they flatlined 5 years after at $38,500. And it takes about $61,000 for a family of 4 to break living wage in California. So we highly encourage, if you're going to do a general education AA, you've got to go and transfer, right? Now in CTE, the average, I'm talking about average across 114 community colleges, CTE was $66,800, so almost double the earning power. So take your psychiatric technician, that's $62K. Your medical sonographer trained on an AA, $76K. Physician's assistant, $112K. And my favorite, because this is one of the programs I seeded when I was in the electrical and power sector, electrical and power line systems, $137K on an AA degree. So as you can imagine, when our policymakers looked at this and compared it to, can we get the skilled workers and can we advance social mobility for the return on investment, the policy dialogue began to shift. So for California, the work has been to transform the workforce mission of the California community colleges from being an afterthought to an actual policy priority. And as a result, the state investments in career technical education has gone from $100 million to $200 million to $700 million and now $900 million in investments. And in that process, we were asked to consolidate the 2 apprenticeship programs, and the system added, state added more monies. We were asked to integrate the 2 adult education programs in order to further social mobility, and the state added more money. And we began to regionalize the coordination and collaboration of career technical education at the community college level, and the state had added more money. And I say that because we're not the only state who's been active in this type of restructuring. So as you think of the federal policies, know that the states have been at this work for the last few years, and so you're actually attempting to put more wind in our sails rather than you're not starting from scratch. More importantly, or equally as important as the money, is that you have to align the money, the metrics, and the data so that you get the policy goals that you want. So our two, Tamara and Scott have talked about the money aspect, and it's very important just recognizing the costs, but setting the right incentives. The metrics, we had big deliberations around the metrics because traditionally in higher education, we value completion of certificates and degrees, and we value transfer readiness, right, or success in transfer. In the world of workforce, we have now updated our kind of what we call the Uber system metrics to add the workforce metrics. And they're all aligned with the WIOA metrics, the federal WIOA metrics. So now we also value, did the students break living wage? We value, did the student have a wage gain? And or did the students get jobs in the field that they studied? So those are our 5 sets of Uber metrics now for the system. And once we were able to upgrade our metrics to recognize all that, the system began to exhibit more of the behaviors that we wanted. And then lastly, the data. It's really important that we can free the data for the practitioners, in addition to the students and their families. But where we invested were really these tools, not because there isn't data, but it's the visualization of data so that practitioners can do good things with the data. So for example, what we rolled out last year is a tool called the Launch Board. And in this tool, for every single certificate and degree, the faculty and the administrators can see how the students fared on those Uber metrics that I talked about, right? And they're able to look up who does it best within the state so that if they're motivated, they can go and benchmark those programs and see what are key elements. In addition, we also incorporate and regionalize that data. So if you can imagine, like, if you take these 3 tables, that's the number of community colleges in the Bay Area, the greater San Francisco, San Jose Bay Area. Now, one problem what we have is when there's a labor market need, everybody reads it in isolation, and then everybody builds programs. And then as it starts to shrink, everybody shuts down their program. So this massive swing in capacity. So of course, a natural question you would have is, why don't we coordinate and collaborate, right? Because we want to calibrate supply and demand. So part of the data tool is showing, hey, you produce 200 administration of justice. Let's assume all of you produce 200 administration of justice. Now let's add that up together at the regional level. Are we undersupplying and oversupplying compared to the labor market need for that occupation? So compared to the burning glass and the EMSI data. And so we're able to now show a college how they exist within the regional economy and their role in the regional economy. And that also facilitates the continuous improvement, but also the calibration of supply and demand, because again, these programs are expensive, but students also move around within the system of colleges. So there's a lot to discuss about, but one thing I would throw out there is now that we've done so much work on the metrics, we would really love for the Perkins metric to just align with WIOA so that all these systems can work together, and it would reduce the kind of the data collection burden on both our K-12 and our colleges.
Thank you. So we have maybe 10 to 12 minutes for questions. We're going to open it up to the floor, of course. It's very valuable. So the question, there's obviously policy issues, you alluded to them. No discussion of the federal government, they were hardly mentioned at all. I mean, obviously Pell matters, right? This is critical flow of money into the community colleges. So what has to be done with Pell, or what can be done to make it more responsive to these like non-credit courses and certificates and things like that? So I think we need that's worth the discussion. And then, so besides money, does the Fed have any role in this, or is it all just working with with states and community college districts? So you're a big system. North Carolina was a system, but in many places their district, right, community colleges are run by counties or by community college districts, and that has to add even more complexity to the issue. So Is there a role for the Fed in all this,
So
except giving you money?
I'm a radical reformer on what's called Title IV, which is the part of the Higher Education Act that goes to that's the money. And it's total, it's $130 billion. And if you add up all the money, including some of that money that goes to workforce education, it's about 22 billion. So we're talking like total, it's a pie chart that would just drives you crazy. It's 130 billion with a very small piece of it going to career and technical ed. About 30 of it is grants, Pell Grants, and the rest are loans. But just look at that 30, right? You can't use your Perkins money at an unaccredited institution or unaccredited program. You can't use it, so the Amazon Supply School, you can't use it there. At the Associated Builders and Contractors Training Center, you can't use it there. The apprenticeship at the company, you can't use it there. You can't use it if it's a non-credit program at a college, which, I think as we see, are some of the most interesting workforce programs. And you can't use it if it's not a full semester long. So basically, a lot of this really interesting work, you can't use your Pell Grant. I would totally explode that. And the problem is, and make all those, you'd have to add it with accountability, some different kinds of accountability, so that you weren't exploding the whole program to cost 10 times as much. And the problem is, the people who are now getting that 130 billion don't really want to give it up. And so change is going to probably be very incremental. I'm somebody who used to do immigration reform, so I sort of take on long-term challenges. But Obama did an interesting experiment where 8 different programs and schools around the country could experiment where a non-credit, non-Title IV eligible program could get money through the local community college or university. A little experiment to see if they could make it work. I don't think we have any results from the EQUIP experiment, but so I'm a radical reformer on what the feds should do with
So we're
Title
going to blow
IV.
up Perkins, we're going to blow up Pell, and...
On Pell, there's a few specific things, if I might
Okay,
mention.
yeah.
So, first, I think we need to recognize we made a big step here recently that is summer Pell. I mean, it's crazy to have students who are primarily adults, many of them trying to get into the workplace, having to stop in the summer, like they're going to go be lifeguards for the summer. So that doesn't happen. So I think summer Pell is a major move forward, but we can keep moving Pell forward. I think the next big move should be around certification. There's a bipartisan legislation introduced by one of our senators, Senator Tim Kaine, with Rob Portman, called the Jobs Act, which is around short-term Pell. I do think it needs to be tied to some type of alternative credential like certification that's built into that, but I think that would be a big place. And it was mentioned before, I think Nancy Hoffman mentioned about Pell for early college. I mean, one of the things that's happening with declining funding, our college provides, zero tuition dual enrollment. But that's getting more and more challenging because then you're only dependent on the state funding and you're just supplementing everything. And so as that goes down, so I think that is something that needs to be looked at. But I think in looking at that, it's important to look at dual enrollment and to make sure that pathways, including CTE pathways, drive earlier into high schools, because with a lot of dual enrollment, students in the 12th grade are just, they're taking random based, in North Carolina, we found before we kind of did a pathways model that 26% of all the enrollments were in introductory psych and introductory sociology. Ouch. So, you've got to kind of look at what that is. And I think that's also a place that we really ought to think about with Perkins. I think we need to push for much more coordinated Perkins high school to community college pathways that have been talked about. Sometimes that steps on some toes because that's not the way we've always done it, but I think that's something that's important and needed.
So I'll get to you in a second, because I just want to follow up on because the word certifications just came up, right? And this again is like one of these new magic shiny bright objects that everybody, certifications, apprenticeships. We could talk about free college for all kinds of bright shiny things. But certifications, okay? So I don't know. Does anybody even know how many?
Yeah, so Burning Glass, so there are a couple different estimates. ANSI says there are 4,000 in the country. Burning Glass, I think, thinks there are more. Burning Glass says that the top 75% of them are the top one, they look at the job postings. And so, they see job posting ads for like 2,600, but only 100 of them, 75% of them are for 100.
So the question is, we could ultimately, we will be able, we hope, to be able to get outcomes for certifications, right? So we'll know like which ones, actually Burning Glass has some indications of which ones really matter and which ones ones don't. So should government subsidies go to certifications that have very low ROI, or should we actually be
No, they
tying?
should go to ones that have very high ROI.
No, but I mean,
So, but first I think you have to take, so one thing you got to take too is healthcare. Healthcare is different. It's not certification, but it's licensure.
yes.
And that's kind of even a more extensive form of but then there's some program areas where the certifications are so strong, and I mentioned welding, AWS welding certifications are so,
It really means-
NIMS and
right.
machining, and in IT areas, you see that, but then there's some areas that they really, and there are way too many meaningless certifications compared to meaningful certifications, but when those meaningful ones are there, they do have real meaning in the workplace.
Right, it's not the first time that we've gone through this rodeo in terms of short-term Pell, so it's really important that we have the quality measure. So if it's proven career technical education in terms of the outcomes, I think that should be fair game, especially for adults who come back. And then also if the employers demonstrate that they value it within the region or within the state, then I think those are the ones where you need support. The other financial aid is really think about the work study, because the prior panel talked about work-based learning and students seeing education in context. Is there a way to restructure a work study so that it's paired with your career technical education as a way to get that? On the high school side, I think, the few things that we ask, we love dual enrollment, that's a key strategy. We really ask for early career exploration and work-based learning. If you even look at the bachelor level, the number one area of major for African-American students is social services, and for Latino students, it is early childhood education. Now, you can take similar aptitudes and perhaps, why do you choose early childhood education and not choose allied health, for example, in terms of options? I think we all grow up knowing certain occupation. I know my policemen, I know my teachers, I know, my athletes, et cetera. Nobody knows what medical sonographers are, right? Who knows what health informatics? So nobody's going to chase those occupations unless we have some career exploration. So that is an area where across the board we're going to need both our K-12 system, our higher ed, but also our community-based organizations to help get the word out.
So, but now Scott's not telling about a really interesting program in Virginia. Why don't I just tee it up? Why don't you talk about it? State money for industry-recognized credentials.
Yeah, I'm being quiet because it's actually in hiatus right now because we're out of money, so it stopped in November.
Oh dear, I didn't know that. Oh my God.
Yeah, but it's actually, we think it's the first performance-based, non-degree program in the country. So in essence, it provides funding for high-demand certifications determined regionally, where we are able to offer those programs at 1/3 the market cost, and then we get 1/3 of the funding after a student completes the training education, and then the last third comes when they actually complete the certification. And it has been so popular that now we have more people than we can support, so we made it through November this year, and we're hoping now to get additional funding so we can grow overall, but grow in terms of making it through a complete year as well.
And in Florida, they've even figured out how to give people college credit for their industry certifications, for the ones that they talk to employers and they're high demand and they're industries that are growing in the state and stuff like that. And they figured out a lot of states say you can't do it.
One of the key here, I think that's important as we look at is when you can structure programs so that certifications are embedded in the program. That's what stackable refers to. But the notion that you can come out, to be honest with you, hardly anybody goes to a community college to get an associate's degree. I mean, nobody grew up saying, I want to go to a community college to get an associate's degree someday. They come to get a good job, to move up in their job, or to get a bachelor's degree. And so that's why, when you compare, if someone just has an associate in arts, that does, they've got to keep going and get that. They get that to get a bachelor's degree. That just means they didn't get there. But with the applied areas, it's important for us to, where we can, embed these meaningful credentials, because when someone comes out, if they have one of our associate degrees and they have all of these credentials that are recognized, if they're recognized, that's important. And so when we can embed those, also if we can find opportunities for working adults to get footholds with those certifications, come in through a non-degree route, get a credential that's going to allow them to get a foothold in the workplace as a job, but then count that towards credit and get a degree that's going to help them move up and further to get a better job in that same field. I think that's the secret sauce.
Okay, we're going to open up the floor for some questions. We have about, well, we're already running behind. So maybe 5 questions, 4 or 5 questions. As you know, I will just repeat the guidance. Identify yourself, your name, your organization, and ask a question. It is not speechifying. Okay, and we have microphones hanging around. So are there any questions? Over here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Kate Kramer with Advanced CTE. So I was going to say the word stackability was the one buzzword you didn't get to, but thank you, Scott, for slipping it in there. But I'm curious about that issue between the credit and non-credit. And as we talk about providing opportunities, thinking about career pathway systems, are you in your states, or have you seen in other states, really good models of taking those non-credit and figuring out a way to actually make them credit or make them actually stack or integrate with credit programs?
Well, again, Florida is the one I would point to. Florida has totally separate non-credit. You don't go to the same school. It's a place in the county that's a county run. It's sort of like a Uber high school kind of, only it's not. But they figured out a way that you can move from those places now to community colleges, and it's very popular, and a lot more people are doing it. And the colleges who used to kind of look down their noses at the people coming from those places, now that it works this way, are using it actually as a marketing tool. So I'm sure it's not the only state, but it is one interesting experiment.
In North Carolina, when I was there, one of the things that we did that was a multi-year effort is we took 5 areas, what we call as the 5 big technician areas, transportation, IT, IT had already been done, manufacturing, multiple areas, and took the career pyramids and started with what courses hit those pyramids, but then also tried to structure the CTE programs, those technical programs, such that the courses across the state would lead to the skills so you would get that certification, so that the certifications were embedded. And so we took a real effort to look at that, and then the funding is based on the notion that if you get a certification like that outside of the degree area, you're still going to get the same amount of funding for that. And so that allows for more carrying of credit into the program. But we did go through a multi-year, multi-faculty across the state, 58 college effort to structure those programs to create that stackability.
So in California, we did the first step, which is equalize the funding between non-credit and credit. But as you think about federal policy, I would encourage continued experimentation and just push it towards the competency base, because on the employer side, what is this credit, non-credit, like not for credit? I mean, it just causes them to shut down completely, right? Rather, what they want to know is what can the person do? I mean, and what is the common denominator? So I would encourage more experimentation with that, even as we struggle to figure out all the transitions between non-credit and credit.
There's a question over here.
Jeff Cleland with the George W. Bush Institute. I do most of our work around military and veterans in this issue, and I was wondering if you had any best practices, and not to get too specific on that, but more like adult learners and how to streamline that process of folks that maybe are leaving the military or adults that are coming to the community college system to get them back into the workforce maybe a little bit faster, or to get them into a 4-year program faster if that's the route they want to take.
Well, I think the similar model around credit is with military occupational specialties and being aggressive around that. So the military is certainly, the work that's been going on there is starting to align more and more. So for instance, in our cyber program, we will take up to, I think it's 24 MOS credits for people coming in and have those military occupational specialties. I think that's one area. I think also there's a lot of education that takes place in the military. So we partner very closely at NOVA with Marine Corps University and trying to align, through the education that they get that may lead to credit as well within our program. So trying wherever we can to make sure that where it's legit to give credit for those skills that are learned in that regard.
One last question. Over there.
Nancy Hoffman, Jobs for the Future. I worry a bit about not differentiating populations that come into community college. we did a study a long time ago. It looked like most of the young students were being counseled into or deciding they wanted to do transfer degrees. Do you do anything, or should there be something done to do better advising for those students, because they also end up swirling and then often not completing?
So the answer is yes, and it goes back to my request, which is more career exploration. So people check the transfer box because partially the financial aid pairs with the number of credits. So that's the easiest box to select. The other thing that students select is the biggest pathway that they select is accounting, but that's only because it's A. Right? So the data is actually not very useful to us. So if there's proper career exploration, we can actually get them onto a guided pathway and really begin building out the whole schedule. But without the career exploration, you're going to get A, and you're going to get transfer.
We're also implementing new technologies, which will have an impact. So, a lot of students now, they know how to go out and get information, but through combining of technology, what we call iPass, students will be able to get more. For instance, now they could figure out how much do you earn, how many jobs were in this county last year, and what was the average salary, and what do you have to do to get there in a much easier way. We're part of, with EAB, their Navigate pilot, and we piloted that recently, and one of the most surprising things for us was 44% of the students who piloted said they would have selected another major if they had had that information up front. So I think that's going to help somewhat.
Okay, thanks. We're out of time, so I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank the panels, and have a good day.